Tonight, we're diving into a tender what-if from the world of Dune, the long, quiet story of a choice made at the very edge of power and the gentle life that might have followed it. Imagine Paul Atreides at the height of his victory, the Emperor fallen, the throne of the known universe within his reach, and the terrible holy war waiting just beyond it. And imagine that in that moment he turned away, that he chose Chani and a simple life in the desert over the crown and all its blood. Settle in now, let your shoulders soften, and let the room around you grow dim and warm. There is nothing here to solve and nothing here to fear, only a slow, steady telling meant to carry you toward rest. Over the next 20 chapters, we will follow the road not taken, a young man who set down a universe to keep a single love, and the quiet years he and Chani built together beneath the 2 moons of Arrakis. You do not need to remember any of it, and you do not need to hold on. Let the story move through you like a slow tide across the dunes, and let it carry you, softly, down towards sleep. There is a moment, in the great hall of Arrakis, when everything in the universe seems to hold its breath. The storm that carried the Fremen down from the mountains has spent itself against the shields and the walls, and now only a hush remains. Dust drifts in the tall shafts of light. The old emperor, Shaddam IV, sits fallen from his own power, his Sardaukar broken, his house brought low. Around him the great lords of the Landsraad wait, and the guild representatives wait, and the Reverend Mother waits, and every one of them understands that the young man standing before them holds the whole of the Imperium in the palm of his hand. The spice, the throne, the fate of 1,000,000 worlds. All of it has narrowed to this single quiet room and this single quiet figure. Paul Atreides stands at the center of it, and he does not move. He is very young, and yet he is very old, for he has walked the corridors of time in his mind and seen where every path might lead. He is the one the Bene Gesserit sought across 90 generations, the Kwisatz Haderach, the one who can be many places at once, the mind that bridges what was and what will be. And because of that gift, or that burden, he alone in the room can see the thing the others cannot. He can see the future that waits just beyond this victory, coiled and ready, like a worm beneath the sand. He has seen it many times before, in dreams, in spice trances, in the long nights of the desert. He knows its shape, the way a man knows the shape of his own hand. It begins here, in triumph. It begins with a crown lowered onto his brow and a banner raised above the worlds. And from that beginning, it spreads outward, wave upon wave, legion upon legion, his own name carried across the stars like a fire that no one can put out. He has seen the green and black of the Atreides standard planted on worlds whose names he does not yet know. He has seen the fervor in the eyes of the faithful, and he has seen what that fervor does when it is loosed. He has seen the holy war. He has counted, in the way that only he can count, the dead it would leave behind. Not thousands, not millions, billions of lives spent in his name for a cause he never asked to carry. Tonight, in this telling, he pauses at the very edge of that terrible future. He stands where the path forks, and he lets himself feel the full weight of what lies down the wider road. It would be so easy. That is the thing that has always frightened him most. It would be the easiest thing in all the world to simply say the words, to accept the throne, to let the machinery close its jaws around him and carry him forward. The Fremen already believe. The legions are already gathering in their hearts. All he would have to do is nothing. All he would have to do is allow himself to be swept along by the current he himself has raised, and the current would do the rest. It would drown the galaxy in blood, gently, inevitably, and call it destiny. He looks at the fallen emperor and does not see a rival to be crushed. He looks at the great lords and does not see subjects to be ruled. He looks past them, out through the walls of the hall, out across the sand of Arrakis that he has come to love, and he thinks of a smaller thing, a darker room in a distant Sietch. A woman waiting for him there, Chani, of the Fremen, who has never once asked him to be a messiah, who has only ever asked him to be Usul, the man she chose. In all the vast and shifting futures he has walked, she has been the one constant point of stillness, the one place where the desert is quiet and the visions fall away, and he is simply himself. And so, in this room, at the summit of his power, a strange and beautiful calm settles over Paul Atreides. The others cannot see it happening. To them, he is only a young man who has gone still, lost perhaps in the enormity of his win. But within him, a decision is forming, slow and certain, as a dune shifting under the wind. He will not do the easy thing. He will not let himself be carried. He has the strength, and only he has the strength, to plant his feet against the current and refuse to be swept away. He thinks of his father, Duke Leto, who taught him that a man is measured not by the power he seizes, but by the burdens he chooses to carry and the ones he chooses to set down. He thinks of his mother, the Lady Jessica, and of the sisterhood that made him, and of all the long centuries of breeding and scheming that led to his birth, all of it bent toward this single instant, all of it expecting him to reach out and take the prize. He thinks of the water of life still coursing through him, the awful clarity it gave him, the way it tore the veil from time itself. And he understands, with a quiet that is almost like grief and almost like joy, that the gift they gave him was never meant to make him a conqueror. It was meant to let him see clearly enough to refuse. Outside, the desert wind moves across the great open faces of the dunes, patient and old, indifferent to the affairs of emperors. The worms move in the deep, as they have moved for thousands of years, and will move for thousands more. The spice ripens in the sand. None of it needs Paul Atreides to be a god. None of it asks him to bleed the stars. That is a thing only men ask of other men, and it is a thing he finds, at last, that he can decline. The hush in the hall deepens. The great ones wait for him to reach for the crown. They have arranged themselves around the expectation of it, the way iron filings arrange themselves around a hidden magnet. And Paul lets the moment stretch, savoring the last silence before the turning, holding in his mind the two futures side by side. In one of them, he is Muad'Dib, the emperor of the known universe, the prophet whose war will not end in his lifetime nor his children's. In the other, he is only a man in the desert, unknown to history, forgotten by the worlds, loved by a woman and a tribe and the sand itself. He weighs them, one against the other, the ocean of blood against the single quiet life, and he finds that his heart has already chosen. It chose long ago. It chose in the Sietch, in the dark, in Chani's arms, before he ever knew a choice would be asked of him. It chose in every quiet hour they had shared, in every night the desert kept them safe, in every ordinary tenderness that no throne could ever hold. He breathes out, and the breath is the beginning of the end of one destiny and the start of another. He is calm. He is more calm than he has ever been. The visions still crowd at the edges of his mind, all the paths, all the possible tomorrows, but for the first time he does not feel bound to walk any of them. He is free in this instant, in a way that no emperor could ever be free. And knowing that, he prepares to do the thing that no one in the hall expects, the thing that the sisterhood never bred him for, the thing that the whole vast machine of empire has no answer to. he prepares to turn away. Up next in Chapter 2, Turning Away from the Throne, we'll follow Paul as he sets down the crown before it is ever lifted and walks, gently and without fear, out of the halls of power and into a life of his own choosing. The turning, when it comes, is very quiet. There is no thunder in it, no clash of arms, no great and terrible pronouncement to shake the pillars of the hall. That is the strange thing about the largest choices a person can make. They so often arrive not as a storm, but as a stillness. Paul Atreides simply lifts his head and looks upon the assembled powers of the Imperium and lets them understand, slowly, that he will not take what they expect him to take. He does not reach for the crown. The crown is there, in every sense that matters, waiting to be claimed. The Emperor is fallen. The Sardaukar are broken. The great houses of the Landsraad hang above Arrakis in their ships, uncertain, watchful, ready to bend the knee to whoever holds the spice. And Paul holds the spice. He holds the threat that could end all spice production forever. The one lever that could bring the entire civilization of the known universe to its knees. No one in that room doubts that he could seize the throne this very hour. That is precisely why his refusal falls upon them like something out of a dream. For he tells them, in the plain and measured way of the desert, that he does not want it. He tells them that the House of Carino may keep what remains of its dignity, that the daughter of the Emperor, the Princess Irulan, need not be bound to him in any marriage of state, that he will make no claim upon the Golden Lion throne, nor upon the title of Padishah, Emperor. He tells them that the affairs of empire are theirs to settle among themselves, as they always have been, and that he asks only one thing in return, which is to be left alone. The words land, and for a long moment, no one knows what to do with them. The Bene Gesserit have a plan for a Kwisatz Haderach who seizes power. They have plans within plans for that, but they have no plan at all for one who simply walks away. The Guild, which sees ahead along the narrow threads of the future, has folded itself around the certainty that this young man would rule, and now the certainty dissolves in its hands like salt in water. The great lords, who came prepared to resist a tyrant or to flatter one, find themselves facing something they have no name for. A conqueror who declines to conquer. Paul feels the confusion around him, and he is gentle with it. He knows how strange this must seem, how impossible, how close to madness. To hold the whole of creation in one's grasp, and to open the hand and let it go. He does not blame them for their bewilderment. He has felt it himself, in the long nights when the visions pressed against him and the easy path glowed before him like a lit road. He knows the pull of it. He simply knows, too, that a man who follows that road becomes something other than a man, and that the something he would become would not be worth the worlds it cost. And so he sets the terms of his own withdrawal with care, for he is not a fool and he loves the people who followed him. He makes certain that the Fremen will not be betrayed, that their long dream of a green Arrakis will not be traded away in the bargaining that is to come, that the water they have hoarded across the generations remains theirs. He lets the great houses understand that the spice will keep flowing, that trade will go on, that the fragile order of the Imperium need not shatter simply because he has stepped back from it. He asks for no tribute, no fleet, no oath. He asks only that the desert be left to the desert, and that his own name be allowed, in time, to fade. There are those in the hall who cannot believe it, who search his face for the trick, for the hidden ambition, for the deeper game that surely lies beneath so improbable a renunciation. But there is no game. That is the thing they find hardest to accept. A man raised in the House of Atreides, tempered in the desert, remade by the water of life, endowed with a mind that spans the ages, has looked upon the throne of all humankind and found it wanting. He has weighed dominion against a single quiet life, and dominion has come up light. The Lady Jessica watches her son, and something in her old training warns her of what the sisterhood will make of this, of how a refusal can echo down the centuries as loudly as any conquest. But there is another thing in her, older than the training, that understands exactly what her son is doing and why, and she holds her peace. She sees in him a little of his father, the Duke Leto, who always believed that the measure of a ruler was restraint, and she wonders whether Leto, in the end, would have been proud. She thinks that he would. Paul lets the machinery of empire begin, already to move on without him. He can feel it happening even as he stands there, the vast, slow readjustment of 10,000 worlds. The great houses turning to face one another instead of him, the endless negotiations that will fill the vacuum he leaves behind. It is a mercy in its way. The Imperium has survived for millennia without a messiah at its head, and it will survive now. Its troubles will be its own. Its bargains will be struck in council chambers and not on battlefields drenched in his name. He is content to hand it back to the ordinary struggles of ordinary power, and to want no part of them. He thinks, as he prepares to leave that hall for the last time, of all the tomorrows he is closing off with this one choice. The palaces he will never inhabit, the armies he will never command, the histories that will never carry his name in letters of fire. And he finds, to his own quiet wonder, that he does not mourn a single one of them. Each closed door is a weight lifted. Each abandoned future is a burden set down. He feels lighter than he has felt since the day the spice first opened his eyes to the terrible breadth of time. The desert waits for him beyond the walls. It has always waited. It does not care for crowns or thrones or the maneuvering of houses. It cares only for water and wind and the slow turning of its seasons, and it will take him back without a single question. He thinks of the long ride south, into the deep sand, away from the cities and the spaceports and the watching eyes of the powerful. He thinks of the Siege and its cool, dark corridors, of the smell of spice and smoke, of the sound of the Fremen at their evening work. He thinks of Chani, and the thought of her steadies him more than any vision ever could. He imagines her face when he tells her that it is finished, that there will be no war and no crown and no long parade of years spent apart, that he has chosen her and the desert and the ordinary days above everything the universe could offer, and he knows that she will understand, because she is the only one who ever truly did. And so Paul Atreides walks out of the great hall of Arrakis, while the powers of the universe are still trying to understand what has happened. He does not look back at the throne he might have taken. He does not need to. He has already left it behind in his heart, and what lies ahead of him now is not empire, but home. The doors close behind him, and the noise of the Landsraad and the Guild and the Sisterhood fades, and there is only the corridor, and the light, and the long road down into the sand. Up next in Chapter 3, The Holy War Refused, we'll see the legions that would have marched in his name stand down, the billions who would have died left living, and the mantle of Messiah quietly set aside. Word of the refusal moves out across Arrakis, the way water moves through sand, slowly at first, and then everywhere at once. It travels from Siege to Siege, from the great cities to the smallest hidden settlements in the deep desert, carried by riders and by the old wordless understandings of a people who have learned to speak across the emptiness. Muad'Dib will not take the throne. Muad'Dib will not lead the legions to the stars. the one they called the Mahdi, the one whose coming their oldest stories foretold, has looked upon the war that was gathering in his name, and he has told it to stand down. It is a hard thing for the Fremen to hear, at first, for the fervor was already alight in them. They had felt it kindle in their chests through the long campaign, the certainty that they were the instrument of something vast, that their suffering across 10,000 years was about to be answered with dominion over the whole of creation. The young men had sharpened their crysknives and dreamed of green worlds waiting to be taken. The Nabes had begun, quietly, to imagine the shape of an empire built on Fremen strength. All of that had been coiling within them, tighter and tighter. A spring wound almost to the breaking point. And Paul, who can see the shape of that spring better than anyone alive, knows that the most dangerous moment is not the war itself, but the instant before it, when the pressure is greatest and a single word could loose it. So he does not simply refuse from the safety of a distant hall. He goes among them. He rides out to the sietches himself, into the councils of the Nabes, into the gathering places where the fighting men take their evening meal. And he speaks to them not as a god descending, but as one of their own, who has walked in the deep places of time and come back to tell them what he saw. He tells them of the ocean of blood. He describes it not to frighten them, but so that they will understand. He tells them of the worlds that would burn, the billions who would die, the fanaticism that would outlive him and his children and grow into something that no one could control, a fire lit in his name that would consume the very people who kindled it. He tells them that a Fremen fights for water, for family, for the freedom of the sand, and not to drown the stars in slaughter for the sake of a prophecy that off-worlders planted in their grandmothers' minds long ago. He reminds them, gently, that the legend of the Mahdi was never truly theirs. It was seeded among them by the Bene Gesserit, generations back, a tool left in the desert for someone like him to pick up and use. And he tells them that he will not use it. There is grief in this, and he does not pretend otherwise. To set down a destiny is not a painless thing, even a terrible one. Some among the Fremen feel cheated of a glory they had already tasted in their imaginations. Some feel the ache of a purpose withdrawn, the strange emptiness that comes when a great and dreadful task is suddenly lifted away. But Paul is patient with them, and the desert is patient, and slowly the pressure begins to ease. The spring, wound so tight, is let down turn by turn instead of snapped. The crysknives are sheathed, the dreams of conquest cool in the night air, and what settles in their place over the days and the weeks is something quieter and older and truer to who the Fremen have always been. For they were never, in their hearts, a people who wished to rule the galaxy. That was a hunger placed in them from outside. In their hearts they wished only to live free upon their own world, to hoard their water and raise their children and one day walk upon a green Arrakis of their own making. Paul gives them that dream back, undimmed, and he tells them it was always the better one. The green world can still come. It will come slowly, patiently, through the long labor of the ecologists and the planting and the careful turning of the desert into garden, and not through the sword. It does not need a holy war. It never did. Across the wider Imperium, the effect of the refusal is felt as a kind of vast and quiet exhalation, though few who feel it understand its cause. The great houses had braced themselves for a storm out of Arrakis, for the Fremen legions descending upon world after world, for the end of the order they had known for millennia. Some had already begun to arm. Some had already begun to calculate which side to take when the fire came. And then, impossibly, the fire does not come. The legions do not sail. The banners are not raised. The threatened cataclysm simply fails to arrive, and the worlds go on turning, and the people who would have died go on living, never knowing how close the shadow passed over them. That is the strangest mercy of it, and the loneliest. No one will ever build a monument to the war that did not happen. No historian will ever tally the billions who were spared, for they cannot be counted, being alive. A child born on some distant world will grow to old age, never knowing that in another telling of things she would have perished young beneath a green and black banner. A city will stand that would have been ash. A family will keep its water that would have been poured out upon the sand. The whole vast weight of that averted suffering rests upon a single choice made in a single quiet hall, and almost no one will ever know it was made at all. Paul understands this, and he accepts it. He knows that the good a man refrains from destroying leaves no record, that the peace he buys with his renunciation will be invisible precisely because it is peace. He will earn no gratitude for the war he did not start, for you cannot thank a man for a wound he did not give you. And he finds that he does not want the gratitude. He never wanted to be thanked. He only wanted to look at the terrible thing waiting in the future and be able to say, honestly, that he did not let it out. That, he decides, is enough. That quiet certainty, known only to himself and perhaps to Chani, is worth more to him than the loudest praise the worlds could ever offer. And so he sets down the mantle of Messiah, the one he never truly wished to wear. He lays it in the sand of Arrakis, where the sisterhood first left the seed of it, and he walks away from it as lightly as a man setting down a heavy pack at the end of a long day. Muad'Dib, the prophet, the Mahdi, the one who would have shaken the stars, dwindles quietly into memory. The name will linger for a while in the songs of the Sietches, and then it will soften, and then it will fade, until it is only a story that the old ones tell, half legend and half dream, of the man who could have ruled the universe and chose instead to stay. The desert receives the setting down of that burden without comment, as it receives everything, the water and the dead and the passing of the years. The wind moves over the dunes, the worms turn in the deep. And Paul Atreides, no longer a messiah, no longer an emperor, no longer anything but a man who has made his choice, turns his face toward the deep south, toward the hidden Sietches and the woman who waits for him there, and begins the last leg of his journey home. Up next, in Chapter 4, A Quiet Life in the Deep Desert, we'll follow Paul and Chani as they withdraw into the Sietch, into the slow rhythms of Fremen life, and into a future no longer weighed down by prophecy. They go south together, into the deep desert, where the maps grow vague and the reach of cities ends. It is a long journey, made in the old Fremen way, riding the great worms across the open sand by day and sheltering in the rock by night, and Paul finds that he loves every hour of it. There is no council waiting at the end of this road, no throne, no assembly of powers turning their faces toward him. There is only the desert, opening wider and emptier and more beautiful the farther they travel, and Chani beside him, and the wind, and the long, clean silence that he has missed without ever quite knowing he missed it. Chani rides at his side as she has always ridden, sure and easy upon the sand. A daughter of the desert who needs no throne to know exactly who she is. She had listened when he told her of his choice, and she had not been surprised, for she had always known that the emperor the off-worlders wanted him to be was not the man she loved. She had feared, in the worst of the fighting, that she would lose him to the prophecy, that the legend would swallow the man whole and leave her only the shell of a god. And instead he has come back to her, not as Muad'Dib, but as Usul, the name she gave him in the Siege, the name that belongs to no history and no empire, but only to her and to the tribe. That is the man riding beside her now, and it is enough, and it is everything. The Siege that receives them is deep in the southern lands, cut into the living rock, hidden from the eyes of the Imperium as the Fremen have always hidden. To step through its wind traps and into its cool, dark corridors is, for Paul, like stepping into a body of water after a long walk under the sun. The heat and the glare and the vast weight of the open sky fall away, and there is only the close warmth of stone, the smell of spice and smoke, and the massed water of the tribe. The low murmur of many lives lived close together. Here, no one calls him Messiah. Here the children run in the passages, and the women work at the looms, and the men return from the sand with the day's labor, and Paul is simply one more pair of hands, welcome and unremarkable, folded into the life of the place as though he had never left. And that, he finds, is the deepest relief of all. To be unremarkable, to be needed for the ordinary things and not the impossible ones. In the Siege there is always work, and the work is simple and demanding and honest, the kind that leaves a man tired in his body and quiet in his mind. There is water to be tended, for water is life, and the discipline of it never ends. There is spice to be gathered from the sand. There are still suits to be checked and mended, seal by seal, for in the desert a careless suit is a slow death, and the checking of them is a ritual as old as the Fremen themselves. There are the great cisterns to be guarded, the hidden stores of water hoarded across the generations toward the dream of a greener world. Paul takes up his share of all of it, and no one thinks it strange, for a man who does not carry his portion is no true member of the tribe. He learns the rhythms of desert life more deeply than he ever could as a leader passing through. He learns the way the Siege wakes before the dawn to work while the air is cool, and sleeps through the worst of the day's heat and stirs again in the long golden evenings. He learns the seasons of the sand, the times when the storms come walking across the world tall as mountains, and the times of stillness when the dunes lie quiet under the two moons. He learns to read the desert the way the old Fremen read it, in the color of the sky and the smell of the wind and the small signs that tell of worms moving in the deep. He had known these things before, in the way of a student and a stranger. Now he knows them in the way of a man who has given his life to them. And there is a difference, and the difference is peace. Chani teaches him the smaller things, the ones the campaign never had time for. The names the women use for the different sands, the songs sung over the evening meal, the old ones that go back to Poritrin and Bela Tajus, and the long wandering before Arrakis. The proper way to sit in the councils of the Siege when one is only a member and not a leader, to listen more than to speak, to let the Naib guide the talk. She teaches him, without ever quite saying so, how to be small again, how to let the enormous weight of what he was fall away until he is only Usul, only her man, only one desert dweller among many. And he is grateful for the teaching, for after so long spent seeing everything and carrying everything, there is a sweetness beyond words in being allowed, at last, to simply live. The prophecy does not vanish from his mind. He knows it will never entirely vanish. The water of life opened doors in him that cannot be closed, and the futures still flicker sometimes at the edges of his awareness, the paths not taken, the emperor he might have been, the war he refused. But here in the deep desert, with his hands busy at honest work, and Chani near, and the tribe folding him into its ancient rhythms, the visions lose their grip. They become like distant weather, seen far off across the dunes, no longer bearing down upon him. He does not look too far ahead anymore. He has decided not to. And, in choosing not to look, he finds a stillness he never had in all his years of terrible sight, a quiet at the center of himself that no crown could ever have given him. In the evenings, when the work is done, he sits with Chani in the mouth of the Sietch and watches the desert cool and darken, the sand going from gold to rose to deep blue as the light fails and the stars come out hard and bright above the open world. The worms move somewhere out in the dark, patient and enormous, older than any empire. The wind carries the smell of spice up from the dunes. Chani leans against him in the cooling air, and neither of them feels any need to fill the silence, for the silence itself is a kind of belonging. The whole of the desert breathes around them, slow and steady, and their two lives rest inside it like water held safe within stone. And Paul Atreides, who could have ruled the universe, sits in the doorway of a hidden Sietch with the woman he chose, and feels no lack, and wants for nothing, and thinks that he has finally come to the place he was always meant to be. This is the world they will make their life in. Not a palace, but a warren of warm stone. Not a throne, but a place by the fire. Not the maneuvering of houses, but the slow, honest labor of survival, shared with people who ask nothing of him but that he carry his water and mind his suit and take his turn at the work. It is a smaller world than the one he set aside. It is also, he understands now, a truer one and a kinder one, and the only one in all the futures he ever saw where he could be simply and wholly himself. Up next, in Chapter 5, Simply Together, we'll linger in the tenderness of their ordinary days, the closeness of two people who chose each other over everything, unhurried and whole. In the days after Paul Atreides set down the crown he never wanted, the desert did not change. The sun still climbed the sky each morning with the same patient fire, and the sand still whispered under the wind exactly as it had before. What changed was the man and the woman beside him, and the quiet that opened between them like a wide and gentle valley. For the first time since he had come to Arrakis, Paul woke without a weight pressing on his chest. There was no throne waiting for him beyond the dunes. There was only Chani, breathing softly in the dim warmth of their chamber, and the slow, ordinary hours of a life that belonged, at last, entirely to the two of them. They had chosen each other over everything, and now they were learning what that choosing meant. It meant small things. Mostly, it meant the way Chani rose before him and moved through the Sietch with the sure, quiet steps of one born to the desert, and the way Paul learned to match those steps, no longer the outsider, no longer the prophet, only a man walking beside the woman he loved. It meant the sharing of water at the edge of the day, the careful and reverent way the Fremen treated every drop, and how that reverence made even the simplest act between them feel whole. There was nothing hurried in their days now. The universe had let go of them, and they had let go of it, and in that mutual release they found a tenderness that neither had dared to imagine when the future had still been a storm on the horizon. Chani had always known Paul in two halves. There was the young man who had come out of the deep desert with grief in his eyes and a strange gentleness in his hands. And there was the figure others tried to make of him, the Messiah, the Lisan al-Gaib, the voice that could turn the tribes into a flood. She had loved the first and feared the second, feared what it would take from him and from her. Now the second had simply fallen away, like a garment set aside, and what remained was the man she had chosen in the first place. She watched him in the ordinary light of ordinary mornings and saw the tension leaving him season by season, the far look in his eyes softening into something present and near. He was hers now, and she was his, and no crown stood in the space between them. Paul, for his part, discovered that peace was not a single event, but a slow accumulation of unremarkable moments. He had once seen countless futures branching before him, terrible and glorious, and in every one of them there had been a cost measured in the lives of billions. Setting that vision down had felt, at first, like stepping off a cliff. Yet the ground had risen to meet him, and the ground was this. It was Chani teaching him again the names of the desert plants, the ones that held water and the ones that lied about it. It was the two of them sitting in the cool of the evening, while the light drained from the rock, saying little, needing to say little. It was the discovery that a whole day could pass, filled only with work and rest and each other, and that such a day was not empty, but full past the brim. The work itself became a kind of language between them. In the Sietch there was always labor to be done, and Paul took his share without complaint, learning the tasks that the Fremen had performed for 1,000 generations. He tended the moisture seals and helped haul the harvest of the wind traps, and Chani worked beside him or nearby, and in the rhythm of shared effort they spoke to each other in the wordless way of people who have grown into one life. When Paul's hands grew rough and sure from the work, Chani noticed, and something in her settled, because those were the hands of a man who had come home rather than the hands of a man reaching for a scepter. There was a plainness to it all that healed them both. They were not building an empire, they were building a marriage, 1 hour at a time. At night, when the 2 moons rose over the Sietch and the cold came down hard upon the sand, they lay close in the shelter of the rock and listened to the deep silence of the desert. In the old life, such silences had been full of prophecy for Paul, crowded with the murmur of futures he could not unsee. Now the silence was only silence, and it held them the way water holds a swimmer, buoyant and kind. Chani would rest her head against him, and he would feel her breathing slow towards sleep, and he would think that he had traded the rule of the known universe for exactly this, and that he had made the wiser bargain. The stars turned overhead, indifferent and beautiful, and he watched them without the old hunger to command what lay beneath them. There were griefs still, of course, for no life is without them, and theirs had known more than most. They did not pretend otherwise. But grief shared in peace is a lighter thing than grief carried under the burden of destiny, and they carried theirs together, gently, letting time do its slow and honest work. In the evenings they sometimes spoke of the ones they had lost, not in sorrow alone, but in a kind of grateful remembering, and the desert seemed to listen with them, patient and old. Each memory they set down between them became a little lighter for the sharing, and neither of them had to carry any of it alone anymore. Chani had feared once that Paul's love for her might be swallowed by his love for the vast purpose that others pressed upon him. Now she saw that when the purpose was set aside, the love did not shrink but grew, filling the space the prophecy had left behind. He looked at her the way a man looks at the one true thing he has kept, and she understood that she had not been a comfort along the road to greatness. She had been the destination all along. The people of the Sietch watched the two of them with a quiet approval that asked for nothing. Among the Fremen, a bond between man and woman was a serious matter, a joining of water and of trust, and they saw in Paul and Chani a bond that had chosen the desert over the sky. It did not make Paul a legend among them. If anything, it made him more ordinary, more one of their own, a man who had walked away from the greatest of futures to sit among them and share their bread and their labor and their long, cold nights. They respected that choice in the way the desert respects endurance, without praise, but without ever forgetting it. And so the ordinary days accumulated, each one gentle, each one whole. Paul and Chani, simply together, without the shadow of a throne between them, learned that a life could be measured not in the worlds one ruled, but in the mornings one woke beside a beloved face. The tenderness of it was unhurried, and it deepened the way water sinks into sand, quietly, completely. leaving no trace on the surface, but changing everything beneath. They had chosen each other over the whole turning galaxy, and in the small and patient closeness of their days, they found that they had chosen well. The desert kept their secret and asked nothing of them, and they gave the desert their labor and their love. And it was enough. It was more than enough. It was the life they had wanted all along, and now it was theirs. Up next in Chapter 6, Letting the Empire Pass Him By, we'll drift out beyond the siege to watch the wider world turn without him, the great houses maneuvering and the powers of the Imperium slowly making their peace with a Kwisatz Haderach who wanted nothing from them at all. Far beyond the quiet of the siege, out among the 10,000 worlds of the known universe, the great machinery of empire went on turning. It had turned for many thousands of years before Paul Atreides was born, and it would go on turning long after, and now, in this telling, it turned without him. He had stepped back from the throne and let the great houses settle their own future, and the strange truth was that they did settle it, clumsily, cautiously, in the way that powerful and frightened people always do when the one thing they feared most simply declines to happen. The holy war that would have swept across the stars did not come. And so the Imperium was left to be what it had always been, a vast and quarrelsome thing, muddling forward under its own weight. The great houses of the Landsraad met and maneuvered as they had for generations. With the old emperor fallen and no messiah rising, the noble families circled the empty throne like sandhawks, wary, unwilling to be the first to reach too far. Alliances formed and dissolved. Marriages were arranged to knit one house to another. Fortunes shifted, and rivalries that had smoldered for centuries flared and settled again. It was, in its way, the ordinary business of power. And precisely because it was ordinary, it never became catastrophe. No single hand closed over the whole of it. The universe was governed, as it had long been governed, by 1,000 competing interests holding one another in an uneasy and enduring balance. The Spacing Guild, whose navigators folded space and whose ships bound the worlds together, watched all of this with the cold patience of an organization that measured time in centuries. The guild depended on the spice above all things, the spice that only Arrakis could give, and it had feared what a messiah emperor of the Fremen might do with that dependence. A man who commanded the desert commanded the spice, and a man who commanded the spice could bring the whole civilization to its knees with a single threat. That threat had been real, and the guild had felt it like a cold wind. But the man who could have made it had walked away into the sand and asked for nothing. And so the guild breathed out, quietly, and went on ferrying the great ships between the stars, careful never to draw attention to how narrowly the order of things had escaped being overturned. For the Bene Gesserit, the matter was subtler and stranger still. For long ages, the sisterhood had guided the breeding of bloodlines toward a single secret hope, the coming of one they called the Kwisatz Haderach, a being who could look where no sister could look, who could stand in two worlds at once and see across the whole of time. They had wanted him as an instrument, a culmination of their patient work, a power they could shape and steer. And he had come. But he had come early and wild, born of a love that broke their careful design. And now that he had come, he wanted nothing from them at all. He did not seek to lead the sisterhood. He did not seek to command it, or to defy it, or even to be noticed by it. He had simply set himself down in the desert and turned his back on everything the sisters had schemed for. This confounded them more than any rebellion could have. A rival they could understand, an enemy they could plan against. But a Kwisatz Haderach who had achieved the summit of all their designs and then quietly declined to use it left them with nothing to push against. Their reverend mothers considered the situation from every angle and found in the end that there was little to be done. The one they had sought was beyond their reach, not because he hid from them, but because he desired nothing that they held. In the long histories of the sisterhood there had rarely been so complete a frustration, and rarely one so bloodless. They filed it away among their secrets and turned their patience toward other centuries and let the man in the desert be. Paul knew all of this, in the way that he still knew many things, without seeking to know them. Now and then the currents of the wider world reached even the deep sea edges, carried by traders and travelers and the slow gossip of the desert. He heard which house had risen and which had fallen, which alliance had been struck, which quarrel had been patched. He listened to these tidings the way a man listens to weather in a distant land, with mild interest and no stake at all. Once he might have seen in each of these events a thread he could pull, a lever he could work, a future he could bend. Now he saw them as they were, the ordinary doings of an ordinary and enormous civilization that had gotten along without him before and would get along without him again. On the worlds of the great houses, the scribes and the historians did what they always did, and set down their records of successions and treaties and the slow shifting of fortunes. In none of those records did the name of the desert man loom large. He had declined to give them the story they were braced to tell, the story of a conqueror sweeping out of the sand to remake the stars. And so they wrote instead the quieter and truer chronicle of an empire, simply continuing. It was a lesser tale by the measure of drama, and a far kinder one by the measure of lives. The billions who would have filled the histories as the dead of a holy war filled them instead as the living, unremarkable and uncounted, going about their days on 10,000 worlds that never learned how close they had come to ruin. There was a freedom in that which he had not expected. To be forgotten by history, he found, was not a loss, but a release. The powerful of the empire spent their lives grasping to be remembered, building monuments and dynasties against the certainty of their own erasure, and Paul had held in his hands the chance to be the most remembered figure in 10,000 years, the Emperor and Messiah, whose name would ring across the stars for ages. He had let it fall, and in letting it fall, he had discovered that the roar of history was, from a distance, only a roar, and that a man could stand outside it in the quiet of the sand and be content to hear it fade. The wider world, for its part, slowly stopped looking toward Arrakis for a savior. The tales of the desert prophet grew fainter with each passing season, softening into rumor and then into legend and then into a story told without much belief, the kind of story that circulates about many desert peoples and is never quite pinned down. The great houses had other concerns. The guild had its ships to run. The sisterhood had its long designs to tend. And the man they had all, in their different ways, feared or coveted or schemed to possess, became, to the universe at large, a thing half remembered and then not remembered at all. He passed out of the reckoning of empires, and the empires were poorer for it and never knew. For Chani, watching Paul turn his face from all of that, there was a deep and lasting reassurance. She had feared the pull of the wider world, feared that some crisis or some flattery would call him back toward the throne he had refused. But season by season she saw that the pull had no hold on him. When word came of some upheaval among the great houses, he set it aside as easily as a man sets aside an empty cup. He wanted the desert, and the labor, and the 2 moons rising, and her. The empire could have its intrigues. He had let it pass him by, and he watched it recede without a single backward glance, and in that steadiness she found her own peace made complete. Up next, in Chapter 7, the weight of visions set down. We'll turn inward from the vast turning of empires to the quiet of one man's mind, and see how Paul, who once carried the whole of time behind his eyes, learned at last to let the terrible futures flicker and pass without reaching out to steer a single one. Of all the burdens Paul Atreides had set down when he turned away from the throne, the heaviest and the most hidden was the one no one else could see. It was the weight of his visions, the terrible gift of the spice that had opened his mind to the sweep of time itself. Long before he refused the crown, he had already carried within him the sight of countless futures, branching and rebranching, most of them drenched in blood. He had seen the holy war spread from world to world like fire across dry grass. He had seen the numberless dead, the fanatics carrying his name into slaughter, the green banners of a jihad he had never wanted. To look into the future had been, for Paul, to look into an abyss, and for a long time he had believed he was bound to walk toward it, that the sight itself made him its servant. Now, in the quiet of the desert, he learned a different truth. The visions had not gone. They still came to him, especially when the spice was thick in the air of the siege, flickering at the edges of his mind like heat shimmering above the sand. He could still feel the vast branching structure of what might be, the paths spreading out from every choice, the futures crowding and jostling for their chance to become the present. But he no longer felt bound to steer them. That was the change, and it was everything. He had believed that to see a future was to be responsible for it, that a man who could glimpse the shape of time was obligated to seize the wheel and turn it. In laying down the throne, he had also, without quite meaning to, laid down that obligation, and the relief of it was beyond any words he had. He came to understand that much of his old torment had come not from the futures themselves, but from his grasping at them. When he had tried to hold the whole of time in his mind, to weigh every path against every other and choose the least terrible course, he had made himself the prisoner of his own sight. Every glimpse became a duty. Every branching became a burden. The prescience that others envied had been, in truth, a kind of cage, and the bars of that cage were his own conviction that he must act, that he alone could act, that the fate of the universe hung on how well he managed the visions crowding behind his eyes. In the desert, he let that conviction go. He simply stopped reaching for the wheel, and the terrible futures, unreached for, lost much of their power to torment him. They did not vanish. That was not the nature of the gift. Now and again, in the deep of the night or in the shimmering trance that the spice could bring, he would feel the old sight open and the paths would spread before him. And for a moment, he would see the emperor he might have been and the ruin that emperor would have wrought. He saw the fanatic legions. He saw the worlds burning. He saw the mountain of the dead that the holy war would have raised in his name. But he watched these visions now, the way a man on a high cliff watches a storm far out over the sea, aware of its violence and untouched by it, knowing that the storm would break somewhere else, in a future he had chosen not to enter. And then the sight would fade, and he would return to the warm dark of the chamber, and to Chani breathing beside him, and to the simple present that he had made his home. Chani understood, better than anyone, the change in him. She had known the young man haunted by his own sight, the one who woke sometimes from dreams that were not dreams, but glimpses of the terrible days to come. She had seen how the visions had drawn the color from his face and the ease from his bearing, how he had carried himself like a man walking under a weight that never lifted. And she saw, now, that the weight had lifted. He slept more deeply. He laughed more easily, and the laughter reached his eyes. When the far look came over him, as it still sometimes did, it no longer frightened her, because she saw that he returned from it quickly and whole, no longer dragged down into the depths, but merely visiting them and coming back. The prescience had once threatened to swallow him. Now he wore it lightly, the way a man wears an old coat, useful sometimes, never binding. There was a wisdom in his choosing not to look too far ahead, and it was a wisdom the desert had taught him. The Fremen did not try to master the whole of the future. They planned for the next storm, the next harvest, the next generation, and they left the far horizon to itself, trusting the patient work of many lifetimes to carry their dream of a green Arrakis toward a day none of them would live to see. Paul learned that patience. He learned to attend to the near things, the day at hand, the task before him, the face beside him, and to let the far things blur into a haze he did not need to pierce. In refusing to see too far, he found that he could see, for the first time, what was directly in front of him, and that what was directly in front of him was good. It was a stillness he had never known. All his life he had been reached for, shaped, aimed like a weapon toward a purpose designed by others before his birth. The sisterhood had bred toward him. The Fremen had prophesied him. His own gifts had pressed him toward a throne and a war. Beneath all of that pressing there had never been a moment of true rest, a moment in which he was allowed simply to be, without the whole of time and the whole of the future leaning on his shoulders. Now he had that moment, and then another, and then a long string of them, unremarkable and precious, filling his days. The stillness settled into him the way cool settles into stone after the sun goes down, slowly, thoroughly, changing the very substance of him. Sometimes, in the long cool of an evening, he would sit at the mouth of the Sietch and feel the faint pull of the old sight, the way one feels the pull of a current while standing safe upon the shore. He would let it come a little way, and then let it go, and he found that the letting go grew easier with every season, until it became as natural as breathing. The desert had a way of teaching a man the size of himself, and Paul, who had once held the whole of time behind his eyes, learned in the sand that he was only one man after all, and that there was a great and unlooked-for mercy in being only one man. He no longer had to answer for the fate of the stars. He had to answer only for the day at hand, and for the woman who trusted him, and that was a burden light enough to carry with a glad heart. He did not pretend that the visions were a blessing to be welcomed. He knew what they were, and he treated the gift with the respect one gives to something dangerous. But he had made his peace with it. He no longer feared the abyss, because he had learned that a man is not required to leap simply because he can see the edge. He could stand at the edge and look, and step back and go home to his wife and his sietch and his labor under the wide burning sky. The terrible futures flickered at the border of his mind, and he let them flicker, and he set his eyes instead upon the near and quiet things, and in that choosing he found a stillness deep enough to rest in for the whole of a life. Up next in Chapter 8, A Home in Sietch Tabor, we'll follow Paul and Chani into the heart of Stilgar's people and see how the man who set down the whole of time came to be known there not as Muad'Dib the Messiah, but simply as Usul, one of the tribe. Deep in the rock of the shield wall, in the folds of stone that had sheltered the Fremen for longer than any record could reckon, lay Sietch Tabor, the home of Stilgar and his people. It was here that Paul Atreides and Chani made their life, and it was here, among the caverns and the wind traps and the close warm passages carved by patient hands, that Paul came fully into belonging. He had been many things to the Fremen. He had come to them as a fugitive, been taken in as a stranger, tested as an outsider, and named at last with the names that mattered. But in the old telling those names had lifted him above the tribe and set him apart as a figure of prophecy. In this telling, he let the greatest of those names fall away, and kept only the small and dear one, and so he did not rise above the tribe, but sank gratefully into the heart of it. Stilgar, the Naib of Sietch Tabr, had watched Paul travel a long road. He had seen the young man prove himself in the desert, earn his place, take the rights of manhood among the Fremen. He had seen, too, the shadow of the greater destiny that hung over the youth, and like many of his people he had half believed that Paul was the one the old legends promised, the voice from the outer world who would lead them to paradise. When Paul turned away from the throne and the war, Stilgar might have felt betrayed of that hope. Instead, being a man of the desert to the roots of him, he understood. A man who chose the Sietch over the Empire, who chose the tribe over the stars, was a man Stilgar could understand entirely. He welcomed Paul not as a fallen Messiah, but as a Fremen who had come home, and there was no reproach in it, only a deep and gruff acceptance. Among the people of Sietch Tabr, Paul was known as Usul. It was the name they had given him in the intimacy of the Sietch, the name that meant the strength of the base of the pillar, the name that belonged to him among his own. In the wider world he had been called Muad'Dib, the desert mouse, the name of his manhood, and later the name that fanatics would have carried across the stars. But within these walls, he set Muad'Dib aside. Here he was Usul, and Usul was not a prophet, or an emperor, or a weapon of destiny. Usul was a man who shared the labor of the Sietch, who took his turn at the tasks, who sat among the others in the common places, and was one of them. The name held him like a hand held closes around something precious, keeping it safe, keeping it near. He shared in the labor fully, and this above all was what made his belonging real. Among the Fremen, no one was above the work. The water discipline that kept them alive in the deep desert demanded the effort of every hand, and Paul gave his effort without stint. He tended the great wind traps that drew moisture from the night air. He helped in the tending of the Sietch pool, the hidden reservoir of water that was the tribe's treasure and its future. The water they were gathering drop by patient, drop across generations toward the day when Arrakis might bloom. He learned the customs of the harvest and the customs of the storm, the 10,000 small observances by which the Fremen had survived a world that wished them dead. And in learning them, in performing them alongside his people, he ceased to be a man who studied the Fremen way and became a man who lived it. There were customs of the spirit as well as of the body, and Paul entered into these too. The Fremen had their rites and their reverences, their deep and private ceremonies bound up with water and with spice and with the long memory of the tribe. Once Paul had stood at the center of such rites as a figure of awe, the one the prophecy pointed toward. Now, he stood in the circle of them as one participant among many, taking his place in the observances without any place of special honor. And he found this far sweeter than the awe had ever been. To be revered is to be alone. To belong is to be surrounded. He had traded the loneliness of reverence for the warmth of belonging, and he counted it the better trade every single day. The people accepted him fully, and this acceptance was not a small thing, for the Fremen did not give it lightly. They were a people who measured a person by endurance and by loyalty and by the sharing of water. And by these measures Paul had proven himself over and over. They knew he could have been more than they were, could have been the ruler of the universe and the Lord of all the worlds. And they knew he had chosen instead to be one of them, to share their hard and hidden life in the rock. That choice earned him a respect deeper than any homage a Messiah could command. They did not bow to him. They did something far more precious. They counted him as one of their own, a member of the tribe, a man whose water was mingled with theirs. and there was no higher place in all the desert than that. Chani, born of the Fremen, watched Paul take his place among her people with a quiet joy. She had feared that his greatness would carry him away from the siege and away from her, out into the vast machinery of empire where she could not follow as an equal. Instead, she saw him settle into the tribe the way water settles into the deep reservoir, quietly, permanently, becoming part of the whole. He was hers, and he was her people's, and the two loves were no longer at war within him. When she walked with him through the passages of Sietch Tabar and saw the others greet him as Usul, greet him as kin, something in her that had long been tense finally loosened. This was the life she had wanted for him and for herself, and now they were living it together in the home of Stilgar's people. There was a rhythm to the belonging that deepened with every passing season. In the mornings, Paul rose with the others and went to the work, and the work knew his hands now, and the hands of the tribe knew his. At the gatherings he sat where the ordinary people sat, and listened, and took his turn, and no one made room for him as though he were something rare. The children of the siege, who had no memory of any prophecy, knew him only as Usul, a familiar man who might steady a load, or mend a seal, or tell a quiet story in the cool of the evening. To them he was not a legend, but a fixture of their small, warm world, as ordinary and as trusted as the rock itself. And Paul found in their easy acceptance a sweetness that no crowd of worshippers could ever have given him. The siege itself seemed to hold them gently. Its passages were warm with the closeness of many lives, its air thick with the cinnamon smell of spice, its rock cool and enduring against the fury of the desert outside. In the evenings, the sounds of the tribe filled the caverns, the murmur of the day's work done, the settling of a people at rest. Paul, once destined to fill the histories of 10,000 worlds, found his whole world contained within these walls, and found it large enough. He was Usul of Sietch Tabar, one of the tribe, sharing the labor and the customs and the long, slow dream of a green Arrakis. He had a home now, not a throne, but a home, and among Stilgar's people he was known and loved for exactly what he was, and asked to be nothing more. Up next in Chapter 9, A Wedding of the Desert, we'll gather in the siege for the simple and profound rites of the Fremen, the water and the vows, and see Paul and Chani joined not in the politics of empire, but in a marriage rooted deep in the sand. There is a kind of wedding that needs no palace, no banners of the great houses, no envoys from distant worlds counting the gain and the cost of adjoining. Among the Fremen, there was only the siege and the deep rock and the water held in common by the tribe. And it was in that hush that Paul Atreides, known to these people as Usul, was joined to Chani in the way of the desert. He had turned from the throne, and in turning he had given up all the ceremony that a crown could summon, and he found that he did not miss it. What waited for him instead was older and quieter, and it belonged to no empire at all. The Fremen did not marry the way the great houses married, with contracts and dowries and the cold arithmetic of alliance. Among them adjoining was a matter of the tribe, witnessed by those who shared the same water and the same walls of stone. There were no strangers present to be impressed, no cameras of the Imperium, no note taken for the histories. There was only Stilgar, the Naib of Sietch Tabar, standing in the low light with the gravity of a man who had buried and blessed many of his people, and around him the faces of those who had watched Usul grow from an outlander boy into one of their own. The rite was simple, and its simplicity was its depth. Water was the heart of it, for water was life to the Fremen, and to speak of water among them was to speak of everything that mattered. In a world where a single drop was precious beyond gold, the sharing of water was the truest vow two people could make. When Paul and Chani were joined, It was understood that their water was now one water, that what belonged to one belonged to the other, that in the great ledger of the tribe their lives were counted together. This was not sentiment. It was the plainest fact of their survival, and because it was so plain, it was also the most tender thing the desert could offer. In a world that measured love in words, a vow could be spent as cheaply as breath. In this world, where love was measured in water, a vow could not be spoken without giving up something that might otherwise keep a person alive. And so among the Fremen, a promise weighed more than it weighed anywhere else beneath the stars. Chani came to the right, as she had always come to Paul, without ceremony of the false kind, her dark eyes steady and full of the blue of the spice. She was the daughter of Liet Kynes, born to the sand, a Fremen woman who had known thirst and loss and the long discipline of the deep desert. She did not need to be taught what water meant, for she had carried the water of her own dead and given it back to the tribe. And she understood, as Paul was only beginning to understand, that to join her water to his was to promise a lifetime measured in the smallest and most sacred units the world allowed. The sietch had made itself ready in its own quiet fashion. There was no waste, for waste was unknown to the Fremen, but there was care, and care was its own kind of beauty. The passages had been swept, the glow globes dimmed to a warm and amber softness, and the people gathered in their still suits and their robes the color of the sand, their movements unhurried, their voices low. Somewhere the tribe had set aside a portion of their guarded water for the joining, a gift that in the desert meant more than jewels. And the giving of it said, without a single word, that Usul and his Sehaya were held dear. Paul stood among them and felt how far he had come from the boy who had fallen out of the sky onto this burning world. He had been a duke's son, heir to Caladan and its green seas, and then a fugitive, and then, for one terrible glittering moment, the man who might have ruled all the known stars. He had set that down. He had let the throne pass from his hand like water spilled onto sand, and he had walked into the deep desert with Chani, and now he stood in the rock of Sietch Tabor to be joined to her not as Muad'Dib the Messiah, not as the Lisan al-Gaib the legends promised, but only as Usul, a man of the tribe, taking a wife in the way his people took wives. The vows of the desert were not long, and they were not flowered with the false poetry of courts. They spoke of water and of shelter, of the sharing of hardship, of the standing together against the great emptiness of the world. To be joined among the Fremen was to promise that you would carry the other through the dry seasons, that you would guard the other's water as your own, that when death came, you would render back what was owed. And remember, there was nothing in the vows about power, and nothing about thrones, and nothing about the vast machinery of empire that turned somewhere far beyond the dunes. There was only the two of them, and the tribe, and the water, and the sand. Stilgar spoke the words that bound them, his weathered voice filling the low chamber, and the tribe listened, and the moment settled over all of them, like the cool that comes to the desert after the sun is gone. Paul looked at Chani in the amber light and understood that this was the only wedding he had ever wanted, and that if he had taken the throne, he would have taken with it a marriage of state to a princess he did not love, a joining measured in fleets and planets and the loyalty of distant lords. He had refused that. He had chosen this instead, this quiet joining in the rock, this woman whose water was now his water, and he felt no grief for what he had given up, only a deep and steadying peace. When the vows were finished, the tribe did not erupt into the loud rejoicing of other peoples. The Fremen kept their joy the way they kept their water, close and carefully held, and their gladness showed instead in the softening of hard faces, in a hand laid briefly on a shoulder, in the low murmur of blessing that passed from one to another through the crowded chamber. There was food afterward, the plain and nourishing food of the sietch, and there was the spice in the air as there always was, its cinnamon breath woven through everything the Fremen ate and drank and dreamed. It was enough. It was more than enough. Later, when the glow globes had been dimmed further, and the sietch had gone quiet with the deep quiet of the desert night, Paul and Chani sat together in the small space that was now theirs, and neither of them spoke for a long while. There was no need. The vows had said what needed saying, and the water had sealed it, and the silence between them was full and warm rather than empty. Outside, beyond the sealed doors and the moisture traps and the long dark passages of stone, the desert stretched away under the two moons, vast and patient and indifferent to the affairs of empires. And here, in the heart of it, two people who had chosen each other over everything the universe could offer lay down together, joined in the way of the sand, and rested. Paul had ruled nothing that night, and commanded no legions, and held no crown, and he had never in his life felt so entirely rich. The wedding of the desert asked nothing of him, but that he love and be loved, and share his water, and stand beside his Sahaya against the long dry years to come. He gave those things gladly. They were, he understood now, the only things worth giving. Up next in Chapter 10, The Water of Their Life, we'll drift deeper into the sacred rhythms that bound Paul and Chani to the Fremen, the shared mysteries of spice and water, and the quiet spiritual life of a people who had long ago made their peace with a harsh and beautiful world. Among the Fremen, water was not merely a thing one drank. It was the measure of a life, the wealth of a tribe, the substance of every promise and every grief. To understand the Fremen at all was to understand that they had built an entire way of being around the guarding of moisture in a world that wished them dead of thirst, and that in this guarding they had found not only survival, but a kind of holiness. Paul, who had come to them from a world of open oceans, learned this slowly, and Chani, who had been born to it, carried it in her bones. Now that their water was one water, they lived inside that sacredness together, and the living of it deepened them both. The sietch kept its water in great sealed cisterns hidden in the rock, reservoirs that no outsider was ever permitted to see, guarded across the generations toward a dream so patient that no single Fremen expected to witness its fulfillment. Every drop reclaimed from a stillsuit, every measure wrung from the air by the moisture traps, every portion rendered from the bodies of the tribe's own dead, all of it flowed into that hidden hoard. The Fremen did not spend their water. They saved it, the way other people saved for children they would never meet, and in that long saving there lived a faith as deep as any temple could hold. Paul came to know the rights of water the way a man comes to know a language he was not born to. First as a stranger fitting his mouth to unfamiliar shapes, then as one who dreams in the new tongue without noticing the change. He learned the counting of water, the exact and unsentimental arithmetic by which the tribe measured its wealth. He learned the water rings, the small metal tokens that stood for measures of moisture, passed hand to hand as other worlds passed coin, and yet meaning something no coin ever meant. To hold water rings among the Fremen was to hold not riches but responsibility, a share in the survival of everyone who shared your walls. Chani taught him much of this without ever seeming to teach. She would show him the proper care of a stillsuit, the fitting of it, the tending of its seals, for a stillsuit poorly kept was a slow death in the desert, and the Fremen judged a person's discipline by how well they wore one. She would show him the reading of the wind and the reckoning of the dunes, the small daily disciplines that stood between the tribe and the great thirst. And Paul, who had once held in his mind the fates of 100 worlds, gave himself gladly to the mastery of these small and vital things, and found in them a peace the visions had never given him. The spice was woven through all of it, as it was woven through everything on Arrakis. The melange rose from the deep desert where the great worms made it, and it saturated the air of the Sietch. And it colored the eyes of the Fremen the deep and total blue that marked a life steeped in the spice. Paul's own eyes had long since taken that blue, the blue within blue, and Chani's had been that color since her childhood. They ate the spice in their food and breathed it in the air and lived their whole lives inside its cinnamon presence, and it bound them, as it bound all the Fremen, into a single people shaped by a single world. There were deeper mysteries too, and Paul held these with a careful reverence. He knew, better than any Fremen could know, what lay coiled at the heart of the spice and the water both. He had once drunk the water of life, the poison that the Reverend Mothers transformed within their own bodies, the terrible sacrament that opened the inner eye and unrolled the past and the future like a scroll. He carried the memory of that drowning awakening, and he understood the price of it. But in the quiet life he had chosen, he did not seek to walk again in those vast and terrible places. He let the deep mysteries be what they were for the tribe, sacred and guarded and rarely touched, and he did not make himself their master. This was, perhaps, the truest measure of his transformation. The man who might have ruled the universe could have made himself the high priest of every Fremen mystery, could have bent the water and the spice and the old prophecies to his will, could have become the terrible Messiah the desert had been taught to await. He had refused. He let the Reverend Mother keep her office and her rights, let the Sayadina lead the ceremonies as they always had, and took his own place among the ordinary folk of the tribe, one worshipper among many rather than the god they might have made of him. It cost him something to hold back, for the power was real and the temptation was real. But he held back, and in the holding he kept his soul his own. The spiritual life of the Fremen was not loud, and it was not cruel, whatever the outer worlds imagined of the desert people. It was a faith of patience, of endurance, of the long view. They believed that the desert tested them, and that the testing made them worthy, that water withheld today might be water granted to their grandchildren, that a people who kept faith with the sand would in the end inherit a world made green. They carried their dead water back to the tribe and remembered the names, and they marked the seasons of the deep desert, and they lived inside a story so long that no single life could see its ending. Paul, who had glimpsed too many endings, found a strange rest in giving himself to a faith that asked him only to endure and to hope. Chani was his guide through all of it, though she would never have named herself so. She had made her peace with the harsh world long before Paul arrived, and her peace was not resignation, but a deep and rooted acceptance, a love for the desert that did not pretend the desert was kind. She could stand at the edge of the Sietch in the last light of the day and watch the dunes go from gold to violet to the deep blue of the coming night. And Paul, standing beside her, could feel her contentment move into him like water into dry ground. She had lost much to the desert, her father among them, and still she loved it. And that love taught Paul more about acceptance than all his terrible visions ever had. Together they entered into the rhythm of the sacred year, the ceremonies of the Sietch, the gatherings in the deep chambers where the tribe renewed the old bonds. They gave their portions of water to the common store. They kept the small disciplines. They marked the passing of the tribe's dead and the arrival of the newly born. And in the doing of these things, day upon quiet day, they wove their two lives so thoroughly into the life of the Fremen that no seam remained between them and the people. No place where Usul and his Sihaya ended and the tribe began. The water of their life was one water now, held in common with a whole people, poured into a hope so patient it would outlast them both by centuries. Paul had once carried the future of the galaxy in his mind, and it had nearly broken him. Now he carried only his share of the tribe's water and his love for one woman and his place in a long, slow dream of a greener world, and the carrying of these things did not break him at all. It made him whole. Up next in Chapter 11, Children of the Sand, we'll follow the family that Paul and Chani built in the Sietch, the children born to the desert and raised as its own, who would know their father as a loving man and never once as a legend. In time, as the desert seasons turned and turned again, children came to Paul and Chani in the Sietch, and with them came a gentleness that neither the throne nor the visions could ever have given. They were children of the sand, born in the deep rock of Sietch Tabor, cradled in the warm amber light of the glow globes, breathing the cinnamon air of the spice from their very first breath. They would never know the green seas of Caladan or the marble halls of Empire. They would know the dunes and the two moons and the low voices of the tribe, and they would know their father as a loving man and nothing more. This was the gift Paul had bought with his refusal, though he had not thought of it in those terms when he turned from the crown. Had he taken the throne, his children would have been born into the terrible glare of the Imperium, heirs to a holy war, princes and princesses of a dynasty written in blood, watched and weighed and used by every faction in the known universe from the hour of their birth. They would have been symbols before they were ever people. Instead, they were born in the desert to a mother and a father who wanted nothing from them but their laughter, and they grew up free of the weight that would have crushed them. Ordinary children of an ordinary tribe. Chani bore them in the way of the Fremen, tended by the women of the Sietch, and the tribe received each new life the way the desert received rain, as something precious beyond counting. Among a people so few and so beset, a child was the truest wealth, more precious even than water, for a child was the future of the tribe made flesh. When Paul held his firstborn in the low light of the Sietch, he felt something turn over in his chest that no vision had ever stirred, a love so plain and so total that it needed no prophecy to explain it. He had seen the deaths of billions in the futures he refused. Now, he held one small life in his hands, and it was enough to fill the whole of him. The children grew as Fremen children grew, which was to say they grew quickly into competence and care. There was no idleness in the desert, and no room for the long, soft childhood of the great houses. Almost from the time they could walk, the children of the Sietch learned the disciplines that kept the tribe alive. They learned to wear the small stillsuits made for their growing bodies, to tend the seals, to reclaim every drop. They learned the silence of the deep desert, the walking without rhythm that would not call the great worms, the reading of the sand and the wind. They learned the counting of water and the value of it, and they learned it not as a lesson, but as the plain shape of the world they were born into. And yet, for all the hardness of the desert, their childhood was not hard in the way that mattered. It was full of love, and it was full of the tribe. A Fremen child belonged not only to its mother and father, but to the whole Sietch, watched over by many hands, taught by many voices, held inside a web of belonging so dense that no child ever felt alone. Paul's children ran through the passages of Sietch Tabor among a whole generation of desert young, and they were loved by Stilgar, who bounced them on his knee with the gruff tenderness of a man who had buried too many and treasured every new life. And they were loved by the women of the Sietch and by the old and the young alike. Paul watched them grow with a wonder that never dulled. He would sit at the edge of the Sietch in the cool of the evening and watch his children play in the last light. their small shapes dark against the glowing sand, their laughter carrying thin and bright on the desert air, and he would think of the man he had almost become. That man, the emperor on his throne, would have known his children only across vast distances of protocol and power, would have loved them through a screen of advisors and guardians and the endless calculation of the succession. This man, Usul of Sietch Tabr, knew his children with his own hands. He taught them himself. He carried them on his shoulders through the passages. He told them the old stories of the tribe, and he did not tell them who he might have been, for it did not matter. And he wished it never to matter, for they did not know. This was the quiet miracle at the heart of it, and Paul guarded it as carefully as the tribe guarded its water. His children did not know that their father had once stood at the edge of the throne of the known universe. They did not know that legions would have marched at his word, that whole worlds would have burned in his name, that the Bene Gesserit had bred toward him across 90 generations, and the Fremen had been taught to await him as a Messiah. They knew only that their father loved them, that he was strong and gentle, that his hands were sure and his voice was low and kind, that he watched over them and taught them and held them when the desert night grew cold. He was not a legend to them. He was simply their father, and that, to Paul, was the most precious thing he had ever been. Chani mothered them with the deep, steady love of a woman who had known loss and refused to let it make her fearful. She had lost her own father to the desert and its dangers, and she raised her children to love the desert anyway, to respect its cruelty without letting it harden them. She taught them the songs of the Fremen, the low melodies passed down through the generations, and she taught them the names of the tribes dead, and she taught them that water was life, and that life was to be cherished. Between them, Paul and Chani gave their children a childhood that was demanding and free and full of love, rooted in the sand, unweighted by any destiny at all. There were hardships, for there were always hardships in the desert, and not every season was gentle. The great storms came, and the dry months came, and there were nights when the moisture traps yielded little, and the tribe drew close around its guarded water and waited for the world to soften again. The Fremen lived close to death, and the children learned early that the world could take as well as give. But even the hardships were shared, and being shared they were bearable, and the children grew strong inside the shelter of the tribe. They did not want for anything that mattered. They had water enough, and food enough, and love beyond any measure, and a father and a mother who had chosen this life freely and wanted no other. Sometimes, in the deep of the night, Paul would look at his sleeping children and feel the old visions stir at the edges of his mind, the terrible futures he had turned away from, and he would see, faintly, the other children he might have had, the Imperial heirs raised in blood and glory. He would let those images pass. They were not real, and he did not wish them real. What was real was the small, warm breathing of the children of the sand, safe in the rock of Sietch Tabr, dreaming their untroubled dreams beneath the two moons. He had given up a universe, and in its place he had been given this. He did not think he had chosen wrongly. He knew, with a certainty deeper than any prophecy, that he had chosen well. Up next in Chapter 12, the Fremen Way, fully embraced, we'll see the fullness of Paul's transformation, the Outlander made truly one of the tribe, sharing at last in the long, patient dream of a green Arrakis, born not through conquest, but through love and time. There is a difference between a man who lives among a people and a man who becomes one of them, and in the long, slow years of the desert, Paul crossed that difference entirely. He had come to the Fremen as an outlander, a duke's son fallen from the sky, useful to them and dangerous to them, a stranger they had taken in, For a time, he had been something more troubling still. The figure their old prophecies named, the Messiah who might have gathered them into a weapon and hurled them across the stars. He had refused to be that. And in refusing it, day upon day, year upon year, he had quietly become something the prophecies had never imagined. He had become, simply and wholly, a Fremen. The change had not come all at once. It had come the way the desert shaped stone, slowly, patiently, without any single moment one could point to. It came in the wearing of the still suit until it fit him like his own skin. It came in the walking of the sand until the arrhythmic desert stride was more natural to him than any march. It came in the counting of water, the tending of the siege, the keeping of the small disciplines, the sharing of hardship and grief, and the plain daily work of survival. It came in the raising of children who knew no other world, in the burying of the tribe's dead, and the remembering of their names, in 10,000 ordinary acts of belonging. Somewhere in all of it, the Outlander had vanished, and only Usul remained. This was the transformation that mattered, and it was the opposite of the one the desert had once expected of him. The Messiah the Fremen awaited would have transformed them, would have taken their fierce endurance and their desert cunning and forged them into the instrument of a holy war, would have led them off their world to conquer in his name. Paul had turned that future aside. He did not shape the Fremen toward war. Instead, he let the Fremen shape him, and he gave himself to their oldest and gentlest dream, the dream that had nothing to do with conquest at all. For the Fremen had a dream, and it was not a dream of empire. Beneath the fierceness that the outer worlds feared, beneath the reputation for blood and vengeance, the desert people carried a hope so patient and so tender that it could bring tears to the eyes of a hard old Naib. They dreamed of a green Arrakis. They dreamed of a world made gentle, of open water beneath the sky, of plants growing where now there was only sand, of a day, centuries off, when their descendants might walk the surface of their planet without stillsuits and drink from open pools and live free of the great thirst that had ruled every generation of their people. This was the true faith of the Fremen, guarded in the hidden cisterns and passed down in the sacred plans, and it asked of them only patience and sacrifice and the willingness to labor toward a paradise they would never see. Paul gave himself to this dream fully, and in doing so, he found the deepest peace of his life. There was an ecology to the changing of Arrakis, a slow and careful science of trapping moisture and anchoring the dunes, and coaxing the first hardy plants to root in the deep desert. And the Fremen pursued it with the devotion of a priesthood. Water was set aside from the tribe's own precious store and given to the land, buried in the sand as a sacrifice toward the green world to come. Plantings were tended in the hidden places. The great slow work went forward across the generations, a labor of love addressed to descendants who would not be born for hundreds of years. Paul, who had once held the terrible power to remake the galaxy overnight in fire, gave his hands instead to this, the patient greening of a single world, and he found it holy. There was a rightness to it that settled deep in him. The throne would have offered him conquest, the swift and violent reordering of the universe by his single will, worlds bent to his name in a matter of years, and a fountain of blood to pay for it. The desert offered him instead the opposite of conquest, a transformation so slow and so gentle that no one alive would see it completed, achieved not by force but by faith, not by armies, but by the quiet daily labor of an unremarkable people. He had chosen the second. He had set down the power to conquer in order to take up the patience to nurture, and in the exchange he had traded the whole weight of a terrible destiny for the light and steady burden of a shared and hopeful dream. Stilgar, who had watched Usul from the beginning, saw the completeness of the change and was glad of it in his gruff and undemonstrative way. The Naib had once suspected, in the deep places of his heart, that this outlander might be the one the legends promised, and a part of him had feared what that would mean, for the coming of a Messiah was a fire, and a fire consumes. Instead, the outlander had become a brother, a man of the tribe, one who shared the water and the work and the long dream. And Stilgar found in that a relief he had not known he was carrying. Usul asked to be no one's god. He asked only to belong. And the tribe, which had watched him earn his place 1,000 times over, gave him that belonging freely and completely. The other Fremen felt it too. They had taken his measure across the years, in the sietch and in the deep desert, in hardship, and in the raising of children, and in the burying of the dead, and they had found him true. He was not the Messiah of the old songs, and they had stopped expecting him to be. He was Usul, whose water was joined to Chani's, whose children ran in the passages, whose hands had planted moisture in the sand toward the green world. He was one of them. The strangeness had worn away entirely, and what remained was a man wholly at home among a people who were wholly his own. And Paul, for his part, felt the last of his old life fall away like a garment he had outgrown. The visions still flickered at the far edges of his mind, the terrible futures he had refused, but they no longer felt like his to steer, and he no longer felt like the man who had once carried them. He was not the Kwisatz Haderach here. He was not Muad'Dib, nor the Lisan al-Gaib, nor the Emperor, who might have been. He was a Fremen of Sietch Tabr, living the dream of his people slowly and patiently, giving his water to the sand and his love to his family and his labor to a green world he would never live to see. He had embraced the way of the desert not as a mask he wore, but as the truth of who he had become. And in that embrace he was, at last, entirely free. The sand did not know his old names and did not care for them. The two moons rose over a man who had set down a universe and taken up a shovel and a stillsuit and a share in a distant paradise, and they found him content. He had wanted this without ever knowing he wanted it, and now that he had it, he would not have traded it for all the thrones that had ever been. The Fremen way was his way now, fully and finally, and it had made of him the one thing the prophecies never promised: a happy man. Up next in Chapter 13, The World Beyond is Left to Itself. We'll turn our gaze to the distant Imperium, enduring without its Messiah Emperor, and to the strange and quiet mercy that the absence of the Holy War brought to worlds that would never know how close they came. Far from the deep desert, far from the sietch where a man once called Muad'Dib now went by a quieter name, the great wheel of the Imperium kept turning. It turned as it had always turned, slowly and heavily, indifferent to the single life that had stepped away from its center. There had been a moment, brief as a breath, when everything might have tilted toward him. He had felt it, standing in the wreckage of the old emperor's power, with the throne within reach of his hand. And then he had let it pass. The wheel, finding no one to seize it, simply went on rolling as wheels do, and the worlds beyond Arrakis settled back into their long, familiar rhythms. On Kaitain, on the 1,000 ordered planets of the Old Order, the great houses gathered and murmured and made their careful arrangements. They had braced themselves for a storm that never came. They had expected legions pouring out of the desert, banners rising over conquered skies, a new master demanding their knees. Instead, there was only silence from Arrakis, a silence that puzzled them for a long while before it began, slowly, to comfort them. The man who could have ruled them all had chosen not to. And so, They were left to govern themselves, to quarrel and bargain and balance one against another, in the old imperfect way that had held the human universe together for 10,000 years. The Landsraad, that vast council of noble houses, took up the business of settling its own future. There were disputes over Arrakis and its precious spice, over who would hold the planet and its harvest now that the old powers had crumbled. But these were ordinary disputes, the kind that lawyers and diplomats and tired old statesmen understood. They were fought with words and treaties and the slow pressure of trade, not with the fire of a holy war. A new arrangement was reached, and then revised, and then reached again, the way such things always were. The spice continued to flow. The guild continued to fold space and carry the ships between the stars. Life, in its enormous and complicated fashion, continued. There were those, of course, who remembered. The Spacing Guild, whose navigators drank deep of the spice and saw the folding paths of the future, knew what had nearly happened and what had been set aside. They had glimpsed, in their trances, the terrible narrowing of every road. The one figure who might have gathered all the tangled threads of destiny into a single fist. And they had glimpsed, too, the moment that figure loosened his grip and let the threads fall loose again. The navigators did not fully understand it. They only knew that a great pressure had lifted from the fabric of things, and that the future, once so dangerously simple, had spread back out into its comfortable, unknowable width. The Bene Gesserit, the ancient sisterhood who had bred and schemed across countless generations toward a single hope for man, found themselves standing before a mystery they could not resolve. Their long program had produced him at last, the one they had waited 10,000 years to see, the mind that could bridge space and time. And he wanted nothing from them. He made no demand, issued no command, asked for no place in their designs. He simply withdrew into the sand and left them holding the empty shape of their own ambition. Some among them counted this a failure. Others, the wiser and quieter ones, came in time to see it differently and wondered whether the man had understood something they had missed. Whether in refusing the throne he had spared them all a fate none of them had truly wished to meet. For the ordinary people, the countless billions who lived and worked and died on the world strung out across the dark, nothing changed, and that was the whole of the miracle. They did not know his name. They did not know that a war had been prepared for them, a war that would have carried banners into their streets and swords into their cities, a war fought in the name of a god they had never chosen. They did not know that they had been counted among the dead in a future that no longer existed. They rose in the mornings and tended their fields and their machines and their children, and the great catastrophe passed them by without ever touching them, invisible as a shadow that falls where no one is standing. It was a strange kind of mercy, this absence. It could not be seen or measured. No monument marked it. No festival celebrated it. For how does one celebrate a thing that did not happen? The billions who went on living never knew they had been spared. They felt only, perhaps, in some quiet corner of the age, that the times were gentler than they might have been, that the wars of that generation were the small and ordinary wars of ambition and greed, and not the vast consuming fire of faith. And even that they did not name, it was simply the weather of their years, mild where it might have been merciless. The merchants went on trading, and the farmers went on planting, and the mothers went on singing their children to sleep, and not one of them lifted a weapon in his name, and not one of them fell beneath a banner bearing his face. The gift he had given them was the gift of an ordinary life, the small and precious ordinariness of days that simply followed one another without catastrophe. It was the humblest of gifts and the greatest, and it was given in secret, and it was received without thanks, and this was exactly as it should have been. The historians, when they came to write of that time, found a puzzling gap at the heart of the record. They knew the old emperor had fallen. They knew the desert planet had risen to sudden and enormous importance. But at the place where a conqueror ought to have stood, where the story seemed to demand a triumphant figure striding onto the throne, there was only a curious emptiness, a road that seemed to lead somewhere, and then, without explanation, simply stopped. Some historians invented reasons. Others confessed they did not understand, and a very few, reading between the dry lines of the chronicles, sensed the shape of the man who had walked away and honored him in silence and wrote nothing at all, because they understood that some choices are best kept out of the loud light of history. And so the Imperium endured, as it had always endured, carrying its troubles on its own broad and weary back. Its palaces glittered, and its councils argued, and its ships crossed the immeasurable dark, and none of it required him. This was precisely as he had wished. He had not wanted to fix the universe, or to rule it, or to remake it in his own image. He had only wanted it to go on without him, to be left to its own imperfect devices, to find its own slow way as it always had. The greatest gift he gave the worlds was that they never learned his name, never bent a knee to him, never marched or bled or prayed for him. He gave them their own future back, unbroken, and asked nothing in return. In the desert, under the wheeling stars, the man who had made this gift slept soundly. He did not follow the news of the great houses. He did not track the fortunes of the Landsraad or the maneuvers of the Sisterhood. Those things belonged to a world he had set down, and he felt no pull to pick them up again. The Imperium was a distant thing now, a rumor carried on the wind of the smugglers and the traders, no more urgent to him than the weather on a planet he would never see. He had traded a universe for a siege, and he did not regret the bargain. The world beyond was left to itself, and he was glad of it, and the quiet of that gladness lay over him like the cool dark of the desert night. Up next in Chapter 14, Old Friends and Quiet Years, we'll sit a while with the people who stayed close to him, with Stilgar growing gray and steady beside the fire, and with the long, gentle weaving of a life among those who loved the man and never the legend. A life is made not only of the one who lives it, but of the faces that gather around it, the hands that reach for the same work, the voices that grow familiar over long years. And so the quiet years of the man once called Muad'Dib were shaped, above all, by the people who chose to remain near him. He had set down a throne and a war and the whole vast apparatus of empire. But he had kept the things that mattered most to him, and chief among these were the old friends whose loyalty had been given freely, long before there was any glory in giving it. Stilgar was the oldest and the truest of them. The Neeb of Sietch Tabr had been a leader of men when Paul was still a boy fresh from the green worlds, and he remained a leader of men now, though the years had begun their patient work upon him. His beard, once dark as the deep night, had gone silver at the edges, and then silver through and through. His hands, which had once gripped a crysknife with the swift certainty of a striking snake, moved a little more slowly, a little more carefully, as the seasons piled up behind him. But his eyes had lost none of their keenness, and his devotion had lost none of its depth. He had loved Paul as a leader and then as a friend, and in these late years he came to love him simply as a man, which is the rarest and steadiest love of all. There had been a time in the future that never came to pass when Stilgar might have become something terrible. He might have watched his friend rise into godhood and lost him to it, might have knelt where once he had stood shoulder to shoulder, might have traded the honest fellowship of two desert men for the hollow worship of a priest before an altar. Paul had seen that future, had seen the moment when Stilgar would cease to be a man in his own eyes and become merely a vessel for a god's will. And the seeing of it had grieved him more than almost anything. So when he turned away from the throne, he was turning away from that as well. He was keeping his friend a friend. And Stilgar, who never knew what he had been spared, went on treating him with the blunt affection of the Sietch, correcting him when he was wrong and praising him when he was right, and never once bowing. There were others too, the loyal companions of Paul's youth, the ones who had crossed the desert with him in the hard early days. There was the memory of Duncan Idaho, the swordmaster who had given his life so that Paul and his mother might live, and whose name was spoken now with the warm ache of old grief rather than the sharp cut of new loss. There was the memory of others fallen, honored in the Fremen way, their water returned to the tribe, their names kept alive in the long recitations that the people made around the fires. And there were the living, the fighters and hunters and watermasters who had known Usul when he first came among them, and who now watched his children grow up in the Sietch as though they were kin, which in every way that counted they were. Gurney Halleck, the warrior troubadour who had taught Paul the blade and the balisset in the lost days on Caledon, found his own strange peace in this new order of things. He was a man built for war, scarred by it inside and out, and there had been a season when his heart cried out for vengeance against the enemies of House Atreides. But the enemies had fallen without a holy war to fell them, and Gurney found that the fire in him could bank down to embers after all. He came, in the quiet years, to sit with Paul in the cool of the evening and to play the old songs on the balisset, the melodies of a green world neither of them would see again. There was no dialogue in these evenings that needed remembering, only the music and the firelight and the companionable silence of men who had traveled a long way together and arrived, at last, somewhere gentle. There was a gentleness in Gurney's later years that few who had known the younger man would have believed possible. The lump of ridged flesh along his jaw, the ink-fine scar he had carried out of the slave pits of long ago, seemed to soften somehow in the firelight of the Sietch, as though the desert had made peace with him as it had made peace with his friend. He taught the children of the tribe a little of the balisset and a little of the old ballads of a world of water and green hills, and the young ones listened wide-eyed to songs of a place they would never see and could scarcely imagine. In this small teaching, he found a purpose that no battlefield had ever given him, and he was, at the last, a contented man. The Lady Jessica, Paul's mother, had her own place in the weaving of those years, though her road wound differently from her son's. She had been made a reverend mother of the Fremen, keeper of the tribe's memory and its sacred water, and she carried that weight with the grave dignity that had always been hers. She watched her son's choice with the complicated feelings of a mother and a Bene Gesserit both, understanding better than anyone what he had renounced, and loving him no less for renouncing it. In her the two worlds met, the world of the sisterhood's long cold designs and the world of the warm desert hearth, and she found, as the years softened her, that the hearth had come to matter more. It was a slow weaving, this life among friends. It did not announce itself with great events. It was made of small, repeated things, of shared meals and shared work and shared grief, of the same faces returning season after season, of children growing tall under the watchful eyes of many elders. It was made of the way Stilgar would lower himself, a little stiffly now, to sit beside the fire, and the way the young ones would gather to hear him tell of the old raids and the old crossings. It was made of the trust that deepens only through time, the trust that cannot be bought or commanded or conjured, but must be grown slowly, like a plant in poor soil, tended day after patient day. Paul had known another kind of loyalty once, or had glimpsed it in the futures he refused. He had seen legions who would die at a word from him, worshippers who would carry his name like a torch across the burning galaxy, a devotion so vast and so fevered that it frightened him to the bone. That devotion would have been given to Muad'Dib, to the Messiah, to the symbol. It would never have been given to the man. And the man, in his wisdom, had wanted no part of it. He had chosen instead this smaller and truer thing, the loyalty of a handful of people who knew his faults and his fears and his ordinary human weariness, and who stayed anyway. That was a wealth no emperor had ever possessed. And so the quiet years accumulated, one upon another, gentle and unremarkable and full. Stilgar grew older and grayer and no less beloved. The old companions aged alongside their friend. Their scars faded to pale lines. Their fierce young hearts settled into a deep and easy warmth. The siege held them all, the living and the remembered, in its warren of cool stone corridors, and the desert turned around them under the changing moons. Paul walked among these people not as a lord above them, but as one thread in the strong fabric they had woven together. And he understood, more each year, that this was the thing he had been seeking all along. Not power over the many, but belonging among the few. Up next in Chapter 15, the spice and the slow days will follow the long, unhurried texture of their life in the sand, the harvesting in the seasons, the great worms moving far off across the dunes, and the wide burning sky under which the days passed one by gentle one. The days in the deep desert had a texture all their own, a rhythm older than any empire and slower than any ambition. They were shaped by the sun and the sand and the spice, by the turning of the seasons and the deep patient logic of survival. And they asked of a person not greatness, but only attention, only the steady willingness to meet each hour as it came. For the man who had once held the fate of the universe in the palm of his hand, there was a profound and unexpected sweetness in this. He had traded the weight of worlds for the weight of a spice sack across his shoulders, and he found the second burden easier to carry and far more honest. The spice was the center of it all, as it had always been the center of Arrakis. The Fremen knew the melange as few outsiders ever could, knew it not as a commodity traded between distant houses, but as a presence woven into the very substance of their lives. It colored the whites of their eyes the deep blue of the desert night, the blue within blue that marked a true child of the sand. It flavored their food and their water and the air of their siege. It ran through their rites and their visions and their long memory, and it lay out there in the open desert, in the great blows and pockets where the sand tides had left it, waiting to be gathered by those brave enough and patient enough to go and take it. Paul went with the harvesting parties, in the seasons when it was safe to go, and he learned the work as the Fremen learned it, in the body and not the book. He learned to read the desert for the telltale signs of a spice blow, the particular color of the sand, the faint cinnamon smell that the wind carried before the eye could see anything at all. He learned to move quickly and quietly across the open dunes, to gather what the desert offered, and be gone before the danger came. For the spice was never given freely. Where there was spice, there was, sooner or later, a worm. The worms moved across the far dunes like living hills, like the slow procession of small mountains walking. From a distance they seemed almost gentle, almost dreamlike, great dark shapes sliding beneath the surface of the sand, sending up their long trailing wakes as a ship sends up its wake upon the sea. The Fremen called them Shai Hulud, the old man of the desert, the maker, and they held the great worms in a reverence that mixed love and terror in equal measure. To see one was to be reminded of the true size of the world and the true smallness of a human life. And there was a strange comfort in that reminder, a putting of things in their proper place. Paul knew the worms as the Fremen knew them. He had learned, in his younger days, the ancient art of calling and riding them, of planting the hooks and mounting the vast rolling flank and traveling the desert on the back of a living god. In the quiet years, he rode them still, not for conquest or war, not to carry an army toward some distant battle, but simply because it was a thing the Fremen did, a part of the fabric of desert life. To ride Shai Hulud across the open sand, with the wind roaring past and the dunes flowing beneath, was to feel wholly alive and wholly small and wholly at home, all at once. He had ridden them once toward the seizing of an empire. Now he rode them only toward the next horizon and back again to the sea edge, and that was enough. The desert had its seasons, subtle to an outsider, but plain to those who lived within them. There was the season of the great storms, the Coriolis winds that could scour the flesh from bone and reshape the whole face of the land in a single screaming night. And in that season, the Fremen kept to their sea edges and let the desert rage itself quiet. There was the season of the caches and the harvests, when the parties went out to gather spice and to tend the hidden plantings. And there was, folded into all of it, the long, slow labor of the Fremen dream, the patient work of water, the moisture traps and the wind traps, and the deep-sealed cisterns where the tribe's wealth of water was hoarded drop by precious drop against the distant day when Arrakis might bloom. For that dream lived on, gently, in these years. The Fremen had always dreamed of a green Arrakis, of open water and growing things, and a world made soft enough to live upon without the constant discipline of the stillsuit. In the future, Paul had refused. That dream had been seized and driven and forced, turned into a tool of empire, hurried along at terrible cost. Here, unhurried, it went on at its own natural pace, a work of generations, planted patiently and tended patiently, and left, in faith, to the children of the children who came after. Paul took his part in it, planting where the ecologists directed, carrying water to the small experimental plots, and he found in this slow green work a satisfaction deeper than any victory. There was a discipline to all of it, a discipline the desert taught to every one of its children. Water was never wasted, not a single drop of it, for water was life itself in a land that offered so little. The Fremen wore their stillsuits with the unthinking ease of a second skin, reclaiming the moisture of their own bodies, honoring each breath and each bead of sweat as a thing too precious to lose. Paul had learned this discipline until it was no longer a burden, but a kind of reverence, a daily prayer offered to the harsh and holy land that held them. In the settled worlds, water fell freely from the sky, and no one thought of it at all. Here, every mouthful was a small miracle, and the awareness of that miracle sharpened the whole of life to a fine and grateful edge. And between the labors, there was time. This, perhaps, was the greatest gift of the slow days, the simple abundance of time. Time to sit in the mouth of the Sietch as the sun went down and watch the desert turn from gold to rose to deep violet to black. Time to feel the day's heat give way to the night's swift cold, and to draw a robe closer and to say nothing at all. Time to watch the stars come out in their uncountable thousands, brighter over the desert than anywhere in the settled worlds, and to feel oneself a small warm point of life beneath that enormous cold glory. In the empire he had refused, there would have been no time for this. There would have been only the endless press of decisions, the ceaseless demand of a universe that wanted feeding. Here there was time, and time was the truest luxury he had ever known. The passage of days grew soft and rounded, one flowing into the next without sharp edges. A morning of harvest, a noon of rest in the cool shade, An evening of quiet talk around the fire. A night of deep and dreamless sleep. Then again, and again, the same shape of hours, and yet never quite the same. For the desert was never quite the same twice, and neither was the heart that met it. There was a spaciousness in this life that the crowded corridors of power could never have held. There was room in it to breathe, to notice, to simply be. And the man who had once been called Muad'Dib breathed and noticed and simply was, and let the slow days carry him gently on, like a leaf upon a wide and unhurried river, under the vast and burning and merciful sky. Up next, in Chapter 16, a future he chose not to follow. We'll linger with the road not taken, with the Emperor Paul might have been, and the visions that rose now and then before his inward eye, and with the quiet, repeated choice by which he turned each time back toward the simple life he loved. There is a particular kind of quiet that belongs to a man who has looked upon all the futures he might have chosen, and chosen, instead, the smallest and the closest of them. Paul carried that quiet within him through the long desert years. He was, still, what the sisterhood had made him, the Kwisatz Haderach, who stood at the crossing point of past and future, and looked out across the whole vast tangled country of what might yet be. That gift had not left him when he left the throne. It had only gone still, the way a great river goes still when it widens into a calm and level lake. But the water was there, and the depth was there, and sometimes, in the silence of the desert night, the visions rose. They came to him unbidden, at the edges of sleep or in the long trance-like hours of the spice, the futures he had turned away from flickering like heat above the sand. And among them all, brightest and most insistent, was the future in which he had said yes. He saw it clearly, the way another man might remember a place he had once nearly gone and turned back from at the last mile. He saw himself upon the throne of 1,000 worlds, the Emperor Paul Muad'Dib, the master of the known universe. He saw the crown and the banners and the vast machinery of dominion, the councils that would have bent to his will, the fleets that would have moved at his word, the endless corridors of a power so great that no single mind before his had ever held it whole. He saw the emperor he might have been, and he studied that figure the way one studies a stranger who wears one's own face. There was a grandeur to that man, undeniable. There was a terrible completeness to him, a fulfillment of everything the long breeding program had reached toward across its 10,000 years. That man had answered the call of destiny. That man had picked up the mantle and worn it, and become the thing that prophecy demanded. And that man, Paul saw with perfect clarity, was drowning. Behind the grandeur lay the ocean of blood that the holy war would have loosed upon the stars, the billions dead in his name, the worlds burned to ash beneath banners bearing his face. Behind the completeness lay a loneliness so vast that no throne could fill it, and no worship could warm it. The emperor, he might have been sat at the summit of everything, and had nothing, and could not even weep. Each time the vision rose, Paul looked upon it fully. He did not flinch from it or push it away. He had learned that the way to be free of a thing is not to refuse to see it, but to see it entirely. To hold it in the open hand of the mind until its power to compel is spent. So he looked. He let the emperor's future unfold before him, the conquests and the coronations and the long, slow rot of the soul that all that glory would have cost him. And then, gently, as one sets down a heavy stone one has been asked to carry, he let it go. And he turned, each time, back toward the small, warm life he had chosen instead. He turned back toward the Sietch, toward the cool stone corridors and the murmur of familiar voices. He turned back toward Chani, sleeping beside him in the deep desert dark, her breath slow and even. Her presence a warmth more real than any crown. He turned back toward his children, growing tall and strong and blue-eyed among the dunes, knowing him only as their father and never as a god. He turned back toward Stilgar and the old companions, toward the harvest and the waterwork and the slow green dream of a living Arrakis. He turned back toward the ordinary and the near and the true, and every time he turned, the turning was easier. Because every time he understood a little better what he had gained by giving up so much. For this was the strange arithmetic of his choice. In the eyes of the universe, he had given up everything, the throne and the power and the name that would have echoed down 10,000 years of history. He had traded the mastery of a galaxy for a place in a desert warren, the worship of billions for the love of a few, the endless dominion of an emperor for the humble labor of a Fremen. By every measure the great houses understood, by every reckoning the sisterhood kept, he had thrown away the greatest prize any human being had ever been offered. And he knew, with a certainty deeper than prophecy, that he had made the wiser bargain. He had traded a universe he could not have enjoyed for a life he could. He had traded the weight of every world for the lightness of his own. There were nights when the pull of the road not taken grew strong, when the Emperor in the vision seemed to turn and look back at him across the gulf of the might have been, seeming almost to ask why the crown had been refused, why the destiny had been set aside, why the greatest man in history had chosen to be no one at all. On such nights, Paul would rise quietly and go to the mouth of the Sietch and stand a while beneath the two moons, letting the cold, clean air fill his lungs, letting the enormous silence of the desert answer the question for him. And the answer was always the same, and always enough. He had chosen this. He had chosen the sand and the moons and the sleeping woman and the growing children and the friends who loved the man and not the myth. He had chosen a life that was small enough to hold and true enough to keep, and no vision of grandeur could make him regret it. So the future he might have followed remained always at the edge of his mind, a road glimpsed now and then through the shifting curtains of time, and he let it remain there, neither denied nor desired. He did not pretend the Emperor had never been possible. He did not hide from the greatness he had set aside. He simply chose, over and over, day after day and year after year, the thing he had chosen at the very beginning, when he stood at the height of his victory and looked upon the ocean of blood and turned away. Each morning was another turning. Each ordinary hour was another quiet refusal of the throne. And in the endless patient repetition of that choice, Paul found not the thin triumph of having conquered a universe, but the deep and settled peace of having conquered, instead, the terrible wish to. Chani understood this in him, though he had never needed to explain it. She had stood beside him in the hour of the choosing, and she had seen him set the crown aside without a backward glance. She did not ask him about the visions that troubled his sleep, and she did not need to. She knew that whatever roads unfolded behind his closed eyes, he woke each morning and reached for her hand, and that this reaching was his answer to all of it. In her he had the whole of what the Emperor could never have bought. The visions grew fainter as the years went on, or perhaps he simply grew more at ease with them, the way one grows at ease with an old scar that no longer aches. The Emperor he might have been faded slowly into a distant figure, honored and understood and gently released. And the man he had actually become stood ever more solidly upon the sand he loved. He had chosen not to follow that great and terrible future, and the not following was itself a kind of quiet, lifelong work, the truest work of his days. And he did it well, and he did it gladly, until the wish to rule had worn away entirely and left only the calm certainty of a man at home in his own small life. Up Next, in Chapter 17, Growing Old Under Two Moons, we'll watch the years draw on in the desert, Paul and Chani aging together beneath the pale twin lights, their children grown, and their love deepened, and the quiet dignity of a long life shared to its gentle end. The years moved over Sietch Tabor, the way water moves through sand, slowly, invisibly, changing everything without ever seeming to hurry. Paul Atreides, who had once stood at the pinnacle of a fallen empire with the throne of the known universe within his reach, grew old among the Fremen, and he grew old well. The desert marked him gently, the way it marked all who lived long within it. The sun that burned over Arrakis pressed fine lines into the corners of his eyes, and the dry wind silvered his hair by slow degrees, and the long walking of a life spent on the open dunes gave his hands the quiet strength of a man who had worked every day of it. He carried his age lightly, the way a man carries something he has come to love, and those who watched him move through the Sietch saw not the ruin of the young warrior he had been, but the deepening of him, the settling of a soul into its proper place. Chani grew old beside him, and in his eyes she never lost the quickness that had first drawn him to her across the crowded floor of the cave all those years before. Her hair had gone the color of moonlit sand, and the small blue in blue of her eyes had softened at the edges, and she moved now with the careful economy of one who has learned exactly what her body can still give. But she was, to Paul, entirely herself, and more herself with every passing year, as though time were not taking her from him, but revealing her more completely. They had lived a long time together in the deep desert, and their love had passed out of the bright, breathless country of its beginning into a wider and quieter land, where two people no longer needed to speak to know each other, where a glance across the fire carried more than any long speech could hold. Under the 2 moons of Arrakis they had built the whole shape of their lives, and now, in the evening of it, they could look back and see that shape entire. The first moon rose early over the rock of the Sietch, pale and enormous, and the second followed later, smaller and colder. And between the two of them, the long desert nights unfolded like a slow and familiar song. Paul had watched those moons rise for more years than he could easily number, and each rising had laid another quiet stone upon the foundation of the life he had chosen. He did not count the years the way an emperor counts the years of a reign, as conquests and decrees and the shifting of borders. He counted them instead as harvests and storms weathered, as children grown, as friends buried in the sand with the proper words, as 10,000 ordinary evenings sitting close to the woman he had refused a universe to keep. Their children were grown now, and that was its own kind of wonder to him, a slow astonishment that had crept up over the years and settled deep in his chest. The small ones, who had once tumbled across the floor of their quarters, who had learned to walk on the packed stone and to read the desert before they could read anything else, had become tall desert folk in their own right, sure-footed and clear-eyed, carrying the water discipline of the Fremen as naturally as they carried their own names. Some had taken partners of their own within the Sietch and the Sietches beyond, and there were smaller ones now. A new generation of desert children who knew Paul only as a beloved and weathered old man. An elder who told slow stories and knew the moods of the sand. To them, he was not Muad'Dib, a name they had never heard spoken with any weight. To them, he was simply an old one of the tribe, a grandfather with patient hands, and he found in that anonymity a sweetness deeper than any throne could have offered. There was a dignity in the way he and Chani aged, and it was not the borrowed dignity of rank, for they had set all rank aside long ago. It was the plain and earned dignity of a long life shared, of two people who had chosen each other early and then kept choosing each other, morning after morning, through every hard season the desert sent them. The Fremen honored the old among them, for on Arrakis to grow old at all was an accomplishment, a sign that a person had read the desert rightly for a great many years and had never once been careless in a place where carelessness meant death. Paul and Chani had earned that honor twice over, and the Sietch gave it to them freely, in the small deferences of daily life, in the seat kept for them near the warmth, in the way the young ones came to them for the wisdom that only long living can distill. In the deep quiet of the nights, when the Sietch had gone still and the only sound was the far, faint sighing of the wind across the dunes, Paul would sometimes lie awake and listen to Chani breathing beside him, and he would feel the whole long weight of their years settle over him like a warm and heavy robe. He thought sometimes of the man he might have been, the emperor on his cold high seat, surrounded by fear and flattery and the endless machinery of power, and he understood, with a certainty that had only grown surer with age, that such a man would never have known this. That man would never have grown old like this, unhurried and unafraid, with the person he loved most breathing softly in the dark beside him. That man would have had the stars, and he would have been alone among them. The desert asked much of those who grew old within it, and Paul did not pretend otherwise. His joints ached in the cold before the dawn, and the long walks grew shorter with the years, and there were seasons when the harvesting had to be left to younger hands while he sat in the shade and watched. But he found that he did not mourn these losses the way he had once imagined he would. Each thing the years took from him seemed to leave behind a deeper stillness, a further softening, as though he were being slowly emptied of everything that was not essential, and what remained was only the love and the quiet and the wide burning sky. He had spent his youth fleeing terrible visions of the future, and now, grown old, he lived almost entirely in the small, warm present, in the cup of spiced coffee in his hands, in the sound of a grandchild laughing, in the touch of Chani's fingers finding his in the dark. And Chani, for her part, had never once looked back with regret upon the life they had made. She had known him when he was a hunted boy with the weight of a dead father upon him, and she had known him when the whole desert had been ready to fall at his feet and call him a god, and she had loved him best in the end for the ordinary man he had chosen to become. Growing old beside him under the two moons was, to her, the fullest answer any life could give, and she gave herself to it wholly, without hurry and without fear. What she had wanted was this: a man wholly present, a life wholly shared, the long, slow accumulation of small and ordinary days until they became, together, something vast. She had gotten exactly what she wished for, and she knew the rareness of that, and she was grateful for it every evening when the pale first moon came climbing over the rock. So the years turned over Sietch Tabor, gentle and unhurried, and Paul and Chani turned with them, deepening like the desert deepens at dusk, when all the harsh bright colors of the day soften at last into the long blue quiet of the coming night. Up next in Chapter 18, the peace he bought with a crown will rest a while in the meaning of his great refusal, the countless living worlds that never knew what his walking away had spared them. There is a kind of greatness that the histories never record, because it leaves no monuments and fights no battles and carves its name into no conquered world. It is the greatness of the thing not done, the war not begun, the ocean of suffering that was turned aside before a single drop of it could fall. This was the greatness that Paul Atreides had achieved, and though no chronicle in the whole of the Imperium would ever set it down, it was, in its silent way, the largest thing any single person had ever done. He had bought a peace for countless worlds, and he had bought it with a crown, laying down the throne of the known universe so that the billions who would have died beneath his banner might go on living, unaware, in the ordinary light of their ordinary days. Paul understood the shape of what he had refused, more clearly perhaps than anyone else alive. He had seen it, once, in the terrible clarity of his visions, the holy war spreading outward from Arrakis like a fire across dry grass, the green banners of Muad'Dib carried from world to world by legions who would kill and die in his name and believe themselves blessed to do it. He had seen the pyres and the emptied cities, the whole of the human universe convulsing in a fever of devotion, the numbers of the dead climbing past any figure a mind could truly hold. 61 billion, some cold corner of his prescience had once whispered to him. Planets sterilized, whole cultures burned away, all of it gathered under his name like a harvest of ashes. He had stood at the very edge of unleashing it, and he had turned away. And in turning away, he had given all those uncounted lives back to themselves. The strangeness of it, the thing that no conqueror in all of history had ever managed, was that the people whose lives he had saved would never know his name. There would be no gratitude for him, no festivals in his honor, no children taught to bless the memory of the man who had spared them. On some distant garden world, a farmer would live out his whole long life and never once suspect that a young man in a desert far away had, by a single quiet choice, allowed him his fields and his family and his peaceful death in old age. On some crowded manufacturing planet, a mother would raise her children to adulthood and never learn that those children had once, in a future that was turned aside, been marked for the fire. This was the pure and anonymous shape of what Paul had done, and he found, as the years deepened, that he wanted it no other way. A gift that demands thanks is only half a gift. The peace he had bought was given freely to people who would never know to ask for it, and that made it whole. He thought sometimes about the strange arithmetic of power, the way the histories always counted greatness in what a person seized rather than in what a person spared. The conquerors were remembered, their names carved deep into the memory of the species, their empires studied and admired long after the blood beneath them had dried. But the true measure of a life, Paul had come to believe, was not in how much of the universe one could bend to one's will. It was in how much suffering one could refuse to cause when the causing of it lay easily within reach. He had held the whole future in his open hand, and he had chosen not to close his fist. There was no statue for that. There was no song. There was only the quiet fact of all those lives going on, somewhere out beyond the dunes, in a peace they mistook for the ordinary condition of the world. And it was not only the lives that his refusal had spared, it was the shape of the future itself, the whole long course of what came after. Paul had glimpsed, in his visions, the terrible aftermath of the throne he did not take, the centuries of rule that would have been needed to justify the war that made it, the way a Messiah once enthroned can never truly step down, the way the machinery of a holy empire grinds on long past the death of the one who set it moving. He had seen a future in which his own name became a chain upon the human spirit, a golden and terrible order that would hold the species frozen for generations. By walking away, he had left that future unwritten. The great houses would rise and fall in their ordinary way. The Landsraad would quarrel and scheme. The guild would fold its long roots across the dark, and none of it would be gathered up into the single crushing fist that his prescience had shown him. The universe would remain messy and free, and its messiness was, in its own way, a mercy. There were nights when Chani, sensing the far movement of his thoughts, would lay her hand upon his chest in the darkness, and he would tell her, in his own quiet way, without speeches and without weight, that he was only thinking again of the road he had not walked. She understood him better than anyone living, for she alone had stood beside him at the edge of that other future and had felt the cold breath of it, and she alone had watched him turn away. It comforted him, in those hours, to know that one other person in all the universe carried the memory with him, that the great refusal had not been made entirely alone. Together they held the secret of the peace they had bought, and together they let it rest, and the holding of it between them became one more thread in the long weave of their marriage. The Fremen who lived beside him knew nothing of this weight. To them, Paul was simply Usul, an elder of the tribe, a man who had come to them long ago as an off-worlder and had become, over the slow years, entirely one of their own. They did not know that the quiet old man who sat among them at the evening fires had once held the fate of the human species in his hands and had chosen, for their sakes and for the sakes of billions he would never meet, to set it gently down. Perhaps that was the truest measure of his sacrifice, that he had given up not only the throne but even the memory of having refused it, that he had let himself be forgotten so completely that not even the people around him knew the size of what he had done. He wore no crown, and he wanted none, and the peace he had purchased spread out silently across the worlds without a single soul to trace it back to its source. In the deep nights, when the visions still flickered at the far edges of his mind, showing him now and then the emperor he might have been and the fire he might have loosed, Paul would draw a slow breath and let the images pass. He no longer feared them, for he had chosen against them once and for all, and every quiet year that followed was another proof that the choice had held. He had bought a peace with a crown, and the crown was gone, and the peace remained, and that was enough. More than enough. It was, he thought, the only thing he had ever done that he was wholly certain had been right. The desert kept his secret, as the desert keeps all things. The sand did not care for names or thrones or the counting of the saved. It only turned beneath the two moons, patient and vast and indifferent, while the old man who had spared a universe grew older within it, content to be nothing more than one small grain among the countless grains, one quiet life among the countless quiet lives his refusal had let go on living. Up next in Chapter 19, What the Desert Gave Him, we'll turn from what he gave away to what he received in return, the gifts of belonging and stillness that the sand pressed quietly into his open hands. If the throne had promised Paul Atreides power and glory and a name that would ring across 10,000 years, the desert made no such promises at all. The desert offered nothing that could be counted or displayed, nothing that could be carried before an assembly of the great houses and set down as proof of a life well spent. And yet, as the long years passed beneath the two moons, Paul came to understand that the desert had given him everything, and that the gifts it pressed so quietly into his hands were of a finer and more lasting substance than anything the crown could ever have offered. The desert gave him love and belonging and stillness, and a life that was truly and wholly his own, freely lived under the wide and open sky. The first of these gifts, and the one from which all the others seemed to flow, was the love he shared with Chani. It was a love that had been allowed to grow to its full height because no throne had ever stood between them, no marriage of state, no cold political wife brought to his side while Chani was pushed into the shadows as a concubine. In the life he had chosen, she was his one and only, his wife in the plain and total Fremen way, and their love had ripened in the sun of that simplicity until it became the strong and quiet center of everything. The desert had given him the chance to love one person completely across a whole lifetime, without division and without apology, and Paul understood that no emperor in his gilded halls had ever possessed a treasure half so rich. The second gift was belonging, and it had come to him slowly, the way trust always comes among the Fremen. He had arrived on Arrakis as an offworlder, a duke's son with soft hands and the strange manners of the great houses, marked in the eyes of the desert people as other, as one who did not truly know the ways of the sand. And over the long years, he had shed that otherness entirely, not by conquering the Fremen or leading them, but by becoming one of them, by learning their water discipline and their silences, by taking his turn at the hard and endless work of survival, by burying their dead and raising his children among theirs. He was Usul now, fully and without reservation, a man of Sietch Tabr, woven so deeply into the fabric of the tribe that the young ones could not imagine the Sietch without him. To belong so completely to a people, to be held by them, and to hold them in return, was a thing the throne could never have given. For a throne sets a person forever above and apart, alone at a height where no true belonging can survive. The third gift was stillness, and it was perhaps the strangest of all, for stillness had been the one thing Paul's youth had never known. He had grown up hunted, first by the treachery that destroyed his house, and then by the terrible pressure of his own prescience, the visions that crowded his mind with 1,000 branching futures and would not let him rest. To be the Kwisatz Haderach was to stand at the center of an unbearable clarity, to see too much, to feel the weight of every possible tomorrow pressing down upon the single fragile present. And then he had chosen against all of that. He had set down the burden of steering the future, had turned his eyes away from the far horizons of what might be, and had let himself live in the small, warm country of the immediate day. And in that turning, the stillness had come to him at last, a deep and settled quiet that no amount of power could have bought. The peace of a man who has stopped trying to hold the whole universe in his hands and has learned instead to hold a single cup of spice coffee, warm against his palms, in the cool of the desert morning. The fourth gift, and the one that gathered up all the others, was the plain fact that the life he lived was his own. On the throne, he would have belonged to the empire, to the endless demands of rule, to the 10,000 petitioners and schemers and priests who would have claimed him every waking hour until there was nothing left of Paul at all, only Muad'Dib, the office and the symbol and the god. He had seen that future too, the slow erasure of the man beneath the Messiah, and he had fled from it into the desert, and the desert had given him back to himself. His days were his own to shape. His hours belonged to no one but the ones he loved. When he walked out onto the dunes in the long light of evening, he walked as a free man, answerable only to the sand and the water and the quiet law of the tribe, and there was no greater luxury in all the known universe than that. And there were smaller gifts, too, folded in among the great ones, the countless ordinary graces of a desert life. There was the taste of spice on the tongue, and the deep companionship of the Sietch at evening, and the sight of the great worms moving across the far dunes like the slow breathing of the planet itself. There was the pleasure of good work well done, the harvesting and the mending and the tending of the wind traps that pulled precious water from the air. There was the laughter of grandchildren, and the long, slow talks with Stilgar in the years before the old Naib passed into the sand, and the simple animal comfort of coming in from the cold desert night into the warm and crowded heart of the cave. None of these things would ever be recorded. None of them would ever be counted greatness. And yet, woven together across a lifetime, they made a wealth that no imperial treasury could have matched. There was the cool blue hour before the dawn, when the Sietch still slept and Paul would sit alone at the entrance and watch the first light come creeping gray across the dunes. There was the smell of the spice on the wind after a storm, and the sound of the young ones learning the old songs, and the particular quiet of Chani sleeping beside him, with her breath rising and falling like a small and steady tide. Each of these was nothing, and each of these was everything, and Paul had learned at last to hold them lightly and to treasure them wholly, both at once. Paul had asked the universe for none of this in the end. He had not chosen the desert because he calculated that it would give him more than the throne. He had chosen it because he loved Chani, and because he could not bear the war, and because some deep and honest part of him had always known that he did not want to be a god. But the desert, in its silent generosity, had rewarded that honesty 100-fold. It had taken the young man who had everything to gain and nothing left to lose, and it had given him, slowly, patiently, across the turning of the years, the only things that a life truly needs: love, belonging, stillness, a life that was his own. He had walked away from a universe, and the desert had quietly handed him a world. In his old age, he understood this fully, and he was grateful, in the wordless way of a man who has made peace with his own past. He would sit in the mouth of the Sietch in the failing light and look out across the dunes toward the place where the sun went down, and he would feel the 4 great gifts resting easily within him, and he would know, without any doubt at all, that he had chosen rightly. The desert had asked everything of him and had given everything back, and the exchange had been the truest bargain of his life. Up next in Chapter 20, the life they never had, now lived at last, will come at last to the fullness of it all, and let the story settle softly down upon the sand and the moonlight and the long-deserved rest. And so we come, softly, to the fullness of it all, to the life they never had, now lived at last, and lived to its very end. There was a life that Paul Atreides and Chani were never meant to have, a life that all the vast machinery of prophecy and empire had conspired to deny them. In the future that was written for them, Paul would have taken the throne, and Chani would have been kept beside it as a beloved shadow, and the war would have swallowed the stars, and neither of them would ever have known a single unhurried day. That was the life the universe had prepared. And in this telling, they set it aside, and they took instead the other life, the quiet one, the one the throne could never have given, and they lived it all the way down to its gentle close. It had been, when measured against the scale of empires, a small life. No world remembered Paul's name. No history recorded the years he spent in Sietch Tabor. When at last he grew very old, and his steps upon the sand grew slow, and the long desert light seemed to gather around him more softly than before, there were no ambassadors at his bedside, no priests, no chroniclers waiting to set down his final words for the ages. There was only the Sietch, warm and dim around him, and the low sound of the wind he had listened to for a lifetime, and Chani, her hand in his, her silvered head bowed close to his own. And that was exactly as he had wished it. He had set down a universe to keep this, and here at the end he found that he had kept it entire, that not one thread of what mattered had been lost. He thought, in those last quiet days, of the whole long shape of the life they had made together. He thought of the young man who had stood at the edge of the terrible future and had turned away, and he felt across all the intervening years a deep and settled tenderness toward that young man, gratitude for the choice he had made when the whole weight of destiny had pressed him the other way. He thought of the wedding in the desert, the water and the vows, the simple rites that had bound him to Chani in the way of the sand. He thought of the children born and raised beneath the 2 moons, and of the grandchildren after them, desert folk to the bone, who would carry some small piece of him onward into years he would never see. He thought of Stilgar, long since gone into the sand, and of all the loyal companions of his youth, and of the slow and loving weave of a life lived among those who knew him only as himself. He thought, too, of the smaller things, the ones no history would ever have found worth recording, and it was these that pressed most warmly upon him at the end. The taste of spiced coffee in the cold before dawn, the particular blue of Chani's eyes in the first light, the rough comfort of a still suit worn until it fit like a second skin. The long walks out across the dunes with nothing to hurry him and nowhere he was required to be. The sound of children learning the water discipline, chanting the old careful counts of the sietch. The great worms passing far off across the sand, slow and immense, the living heart of the only world he had ever truly wanted. These were the things a life is actually made of, he understood now, not the thrones and the banners and the vast decrees, but the small warm graces repeated day after day until they become the whole of a person's happiness. He had chosen a life full of such graces, and it had filled him to the brim. There was no bitterness in him, and no regret, and no backward glance toward the crown. The emperor he might have been had faded, over the years, into a kind of distant stranger, a figure glimpsed once in a vision and never truly met, and Paul felt for him neither envy nor sorrow. That other Paul had ruled a universe, and had been in all the ways that counted, alone. This Paul had ruled nothing at all, and had been, from the day he chose Chani to the day the desert finally called him home, surrounded every hour by love. Between those two lives there had never really been a choice, not for a heart that knew what it wanted, and Paul had known what he wanted from the very beginning, even when the whole of prophecy had roared at him to want otherwise. And Chani, who had walked every step of it beside him, sat with him now in the failing light, and she was not afraid. She had given her life to this man and to this life, freely and without hesitation, and she had never once wished it otherwise. The desert had taught her, long ago, that all things return to the sand in their season, that water is only lent and never kept, and she held Paul's hand now with the same steady love she had held it with across all their years, letting him go the way the Fremen let go of everything, gently, with reverence, with the certainty that nothing truly precious is ever really lost. Their love had been the water of their life, and it did not end so much as it flowed onward, quiet and clear, into whatever lay beyond the last horizon. So the old man closed his eyes in the warm heart of the sietch, with the woman he loved beside him, and the wind of Arrakis singing its long soft song across the dunes outside, and he let go of the small good life he had held so tenderly, and he passed into rest. There was no war to mourn him, and no empire to mark his passing. There was only the sand, and the two moons rising over it, and the deep abiding peace of a man who had wanted the right things, and had been given them in full. In the years that followed, the sietch remembered him the way the Fremen remember all their beloved dead, not with monuments but with water. His moisture returned to the tribe, his name spoken softly at the evening fires. His stories passed down to children who had never seen his face. His grandchildren grew, and their children after them, and something of the quiet man who had chosen love over a crown moved onward through them into the long desert future, unnamed and unrecorded, but real and lasting and enough. He had traded a universe for a single love, and in the desert he had found everything the throne could never give. That was the whole of the story, and it was enough, and it was more than enough. In a galaxy that measured greatness by conquest, he had chosen instead to be forgotten, and in being forgotten, he had been free, and in being free, he had been, across all his long quiet years, more truly himself than any emperor who ever lived. And now, the tale comes to its close, and there is nothing left in it but rest. The sietch is dark and warm. The wind moves gently over the sleeping dunes. The two moons ride high and calm above the desert, pouring their pale light down across the endless sand, across the rock of Sietch Tabor, across the place where a man once set down a crown to keep a single love, and found in that choosing all the peace a life can hold. The story asks nothing more of you now. It only lays itself down, softly, upon the sand and the moonlight, the way Paul laid down his burdens long ago, and it rests. Let it rest. And let yourself rest with it, here in the quiet, beneath the two moons, where the long day is over and the whole desert has grown still, and there is nothing left to do but breathe and drift and sleep. And so we come, softly, to the end of the story. Tonight, we followed the choice made at the height of victory, and a young man turning away from the throne. We watched the holy war refused, a quiet life begun in the deep desert, and Chani and Paul simply together at last. We saw him let the empire pass him by, the weight of his visions set down, a home made in Sietch Tabor, and a wedding of the desert. We followed the water of their life, the children of the sand, the Fremen way fully embraced, and the wide world left to itself. We watched old friends and quiet years, the spice and the slow days, a future he chose not to follow, and two lives growing old under two moons. And we came, at the end, to the peace he bought with a crown, to what the desert gave him, and to the life they never had, now lived at last. There is nothing left now that you must remember. Let each of those distant and difficult things sink away from you, down through still dark water, growing fainter and fainter until only calm remains. You are safe. You are whole. Nothing here is broken, and nothing asks anything of you. Let your breathing slow, and let the last of the day dissolve like mist over a quiet desert at dawn. Good night. If this story carried you toward rest, stay with us. There are many more long, gentle tales waiting for the nights to come.